The Iberian Peninsula, once the province of Hispania, was the land of the Reconquista. The sovereigns of the Islamic and Christian states had struggled for control. Sometimes they were friends and allies, and at other times they were devoted enemies. But after 7 centuries, the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal held dominance. The tide had turned definitively against the Muslims, who had once held supremacy over the land. Now only Granada, the realm of the Nasrid, remained as the last kingdom of Islam. It was completely isolated, with few allies, and by the 15th century was in decline. But, that said, against all the odds, it had managed to endure. Even Castile, the largest of the Christian kingdoms, was unable to complete the Reconquista and now itself faced one of its darkest times. In the early part of December 1474, the King of Castile, Henry IV, had died. Despite occupying the throne of a large realm, he was not a man that was remembered for great exploits. Indeed, behind his back, he gained the unfortunate title, El Impotente. The name referred not just to his failure in ruling his kingdom, governing his economy, and leading his men in battle. It also applied to his marital exploits, or lack thereof. It was rumored in his great court that the child his young wife had given birth to was not his at all. Henry, or Enrique, was a reflection of the poor state of affairs that Castile had descended into in the latter part of the 15th century. The kingdom was a far cry from its glory days, where the great kings of Castile held the initiative. It was, after all, under Ferdinand III that Córdoba and Seville were conquered in the mid-13th century, thus depriving the Iberian Muslims of their spiritual and political capitals, respectively. Then, in the 14th century, Alfonso XI, known as the Avenger, had demolished a massive Marinid force, driving the North African power back into the Maghreb. Alfonso would then come within a hair's breadth of completing the Reconquista, only to be wiped out, along with his immense army, at the gates of Gibraltar by the Black Death. Then came the time of great civil war under Peter the Cruel, which culminated in the rise of the House of Trastamara, which managed to bring some degree of stability. But those days were in the past. Castile was now on the brink of anarchy and collapse. The economy was in tatters, the aristocracy was ready to revolt, and its lands were prepared to secede. It would not have taken much to push the delicate state of affairs into another destructive civil war. But great change was coming, and it was now time for a new sovereign to take the stage. Her name was Isabella. She was a princess of Castile who possessed a resolve that surpassed many of the kings of her lineage. She was the younger half-sister of Henry IV, but was an unlikely candidate to rule on the basis of her birthright and gender. Indeed, no woman had held power over the combined lands of Castile and Leon in 200 years. But now, as her older brother Henry IV, the king, was dead, his only heir being a young girl, and furthermore, her younger brother Alfonso, the Prince of Asturias, who was next in line, had died 6 years prior, she now had a great opportunity before her. At this point in history, she was already married. Her husband, Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of neighboring Aragon, was traveling when word of the king's death became public. He was thus in no position to interfere. On that cold, bright day, December 13th, 1474, This articulate and beautiful, some would argue viciously ambitious, 23-year-old red-haired princess decided that she was going to end the argument of who would rule Castile next. Isabella had taken it upon herself that she and she alone would wear the crown, and make no mistake, this was a coup. The coronation was held in Segovia. It was designed to be an elegant but formidable affair. Isabella had carefully planned it so, with the intent to both shock and awe those witnessing her ascendancy. On that day, she wore not the gown of a princess, but rather that of a queen. It was richly endowed with jewels which broadcasted her authority. She rode upon a magnificent steed, and her entourage followed her devotedly. Before her walked a court official who held above his head an unsheathed sword. Its tip was pointing to the sky. The symbolism was both ancient and clear. Isabella not only wanted to have power, but she was not going to be afraid to use it either. As the day wore on, the procession made its way into the Cathedral of Segovia, where she came before the altar. Just minutes before, she had a silver crown placed on her head. There, in front of everyone to see, she prostrated herself on the floor in prayer, asking her divinity for strength in the enormous trials that laid ahead of her. Her tasks were nearly insurmountable, but she had vision. Isabella's mind looked beyond Iberia. It looked at not just the kingdom she would have to keep together and the aristocracy that she would have to keep in line. Her thoughts transcended her flailing allies, who would be waiting for weakness in her rule for exploitation. Isabella's mind transcended to the level of perceiving the fate of Christianity, which she felt was greatly imperiled. And perhaps she had a really good reason to feel this way. Far to the east, on the other end of the Mediterranean Sea, the power of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II was on the rise. It was only a mere 2 decades before that he had conquered Constantinople, the city of the world's desire, which also happened to be the most formidable stronghold in Christendom. In taking the great city, Mehmed had sealed the fate of the Romans. In doing so, he had brought down a Christian empire that had lasted for over 1,000 years. Constantinople was now his capital, and from there, his vast armies had marched forth, expanding his Islamic domain into the west. His drive knew no bounds, and his dreams for a conquest had just started. The popes of Europe tried in vain to rally a champion to stem the tide, with little result. There were now new fears that if the Ottomans allied themselves with the Nasrid of Granada, they would have a beachhead to begin a new front for an invasion of the Iberian Peninsula. And if that were to prove successful, the remaining kingdoms of Europe would perhaps be fighting a two-front war. It was into this world that Isabella was thrown, an impoverished kingdom teetering on the brink of civil war, surrounded by enemies. But as she stood in the waning sun on that cold winter's day, her determination was as strong as ever. Like her idol, Joan of Arc, who had died 40 years prior, the new Castilian queen saw herself as a defender of the faith, infused by her God with a calling that could not be questioned. Despite her dangerous world and her precarious position in it, she walked with a sense of destiny. Queen Isabella knew then and there that she was going to use whatever means necessary, which included utter brutality, if it was needed to accomplish what she felt was expected of her. She would need this mindset and this determination. The great ordeal which now laid before her would require her full measure of devotion. In the north-central part of the Iberian Peninsula was the isolated sleepy town of Madrigal de las Altas Torres. It had been renowned for very little until the spring of 1451, but on April 22nd of that year, it was here that a princess of Castile was born. Her name was Isabel, or anglicized Isabella. She was the daughter of King John II and his second wife, Isabel of Portugal. But her birth went almost unnoticed by the kingdom. There was no great celebration, no great announcement. The Castilian king, after all, already had a son and heir already. His name was Henry IV. He was born from the union of John II and his first wife, Maria of Aragon. Thus, it would seem that the young princess was destined at her birth to be nothing more than a mere footnote. Indeed, even the details of her baptism were unknown, which for most nobility would have been a noteworthy major event. Isabella's birth, some could argue, appeared to be almost unwanted. Perhaps this was a reflection of the poor state of affairs that Castile was in during the mid-15th century. The kingdom was falling apart, its economy was feeble, its nobility squandered their energy in bitter rivalries, and neighboring kingdoms, especially Aragon, were looking for ways to take advantage. To the south, the Nasrid dynasty continued to rule over Granada. After centuries of Muslim influence, they were the last kingdom of Islam left on the peninsula. Their power, too, was waning, but their mountainous kingdom was still well defended and held on as a bulwark of Islam. Thus, the Reconquista, that is, the Christian reconquest of Iberia, was at this time an almost intangible goal. To make matters even worse, John II, again the King of Castile, was a man who had very little interest in ruling. He gave almost full authority to his high official Álvaro de la Luna, who for all purposes was the de facto king. It was Álvaro de la Luna who arranged for John and Isabel of Portugal to be wed, which Álvaro felt was more advantageous for Castile. King John, by the way, only found out who he was going to marry as he waited at the altar. Thus, Álvaro's power over the king was considerable. This stirred intense resentment in the rest of the nobility and eventually angered the queen. Isabel of Portugal had limited power, but her influence over the king would grow, and eventually she won out. King John was finally persuaded to act. He had Álvaro executed in 1453 and then realized the mistake he had made. The responsibilities of his vast kingdom now fell squarely on his shoulders. The king couldn't take it. He descended into a major depression. Even when Isabel of Portugal gave him another son, named Alfonso, in late 1453, it simply was not enough to alter John's mood. The following year, 1454, the king died. His death would have major repercussions. Kristen Downey, the author of Isabella, the Warrior Queen, explains, quote, "The loss of her husband was another blow to the unhappy Isabel of Portugal. She slipped into what chroniclers would call a profunda tristeza, or a deep sadness, speaking only seldom and staring vacantly into space, perhaps at first as a result of postnatal depression, and then from loneliness and grief. The young Isabella was left virtually parentless. Observers noted a condition that bound her tightly to her younger brother, who shared her tenuous childhood. The two children literally clung to one another. Isabella's older half-brother Enrique, again Henry, took the throne when she was only 3. King Enrique did little to nurture his younger sister and brother, and instead their relationship with him became a source of tension and fear. With such an unpredictable childhood, it was not surprising that Isabella took consolation in an institution that provided the greatest single source of stability, the Catholic Church. This child, who had lost her parents so early, turned to the Church for moral guidance, and in the process became extremely susceptible to its influences. Sin and punishment were recurring motifs for Isabella, but within this construct her personality emerged. While she loved the New Testament, she lived by the morality of the Old Testament. Thus, she would always be inclined to claim an eye for an eye, then turn the other cheek." End quote. Now keep in mind this influence would affect her for the rest of her life. In retrospect, to some, she was a saint, infused by her God and committed to a holy war. And to others, she was the devil incarnate, a religious zealot who justified acts of wanton brutality with her religion. Isabella's childhood was a difficult one. She and her younger brother Alfonso were always in the shadow of the now King Henry IV. While the Castilian ruler had promised to care for his younger siblings, the reality of the situation was that their existence was always in threat. The king scarcely provided. At best, he would be indifferent. In these early years, the siblings only met rarely, but records of these family reunions have been lost to time. Hoping to keep her children out of reach, or at least out of the spotlight, the Queen Mother Isabel of Portugal moved Isabella and Alfonso to the rural town of Arevalo, less than a day's march from Madrigal de las Altas Torres. If there was a bright center to the universe, Isabella was in the place that was farthest from it. Arevalo was devoid of the finesse and culture of the Castilian court. It was a remote fortress with thick stone walls, cold in the winter, blazing hot in the summer. It was built primarily as a military bastion and not so much for comfort. The king would eventually send in soldiers to protect his family, but his men also served to keep his siblings in place, always with a watchful eye. Now, it's from behind these massive walls that Isabella grew up, protected, some would argue imprisoned, from a world that was disintegrating around her. Castile and Leon, as mentioned before, were descending into a dark age. Downey explains, quote, "The instability of Isabella's family life mirrored conditions in the kingdom as a whole. The vacuum of leadership under the feckless King Enrique had permitted the kingdom to descend into chaos. The kingdom's nobles, who could have helped to rule in their regions, instead became brutal and bickering warlords, terrorizing the peasantry, cornering the resources of an increasingly impoverished land. Rape, theft, and murder were rampant. With no central authority on the peninsula, chaos reigned, and most of the residents of Spain lived as Isabella did, near or inside heavily armed compounds. The landscape was so dotted with these stone and wood fortifications that the central kingdom was named Castile, or Land of Castles. The Spanish people lived indoors, crouched behind thick walls made of stone, peering out through tiny windows that served as arrow slits, scanning the horizon for signs of danger, existing in a state of perpetual readiness for conflict. Isabella grew up in a land that was almost perpetually at war." End quote. However, as much as Isabella was sheltered in her upbringing, she also had many powerful influences. Her grandmother, Isabel of Barcelos, also known as Isabel of Braganza, was an extremely intelligent woman. She descended from King John I of Portugal, who ruled over what the Portuguese called the illustrious generation. The children of this king became philosophers, scientists, artists, and included one particular boy named Henry, who would be known to history as Henry the Navigator, whose contribution, by the way, to world exploration cannot be underscored. Grandmother Isabel committed herself to the schooling of the young princess, painstakingly teaching her a broad education, including the Portuguese principle that seafaring and international trade, especially west into the Atlantic Ocean, would be a key to the future, a lesson Isabella would never forget. The young Castilian princess would be nurtured by those around her as well. Her astute governess, who was well versed in politics, the governor of Arevalo, whose children would become Isabella's playmates and in time would become her very loyal friends. It was said that she became an avid reader with an unbounded curiosity, consuming books voraciously. She was multilingual, comfortable not only in French, Italian, and Castilian Spanish, but also in Portuguese. She matured quickly, learning from an early age how to survive politically, that is, keeping her own thoughts private. Religion, too, would have an impact. The monks of the Franciscan monastery, conveniently located in Arevalo, would provide guidance. Furthermore, during her formative years, she was absolutely entranced by the book La Poncea de Francia, that is, The French Princess, which recounted the life of Joan of Arc. In Joan's militant example, Isabella found herself. She, too, wished to be the embodiment of her religion and a defender of the faith. In time, she would get her chance. Meanwhile, in Segovia, King Henry IV presided over his Castilian court. He was considered an unusual man who had a bold and imposing appearance, yet seemed to lack backbone and conviction. On one end, he was considered generous, as he would be a patron to the arts, not to mention sponsoring a remarkable building campaign. But as he grew more confident in his role as a sovereign, again taking the throne in 1454, he created for himself a gilded golden cage. He surrounded himself with ineffectual advisors who would scarcely disagree with his politics or his policies. While Castile-Leon declined all around him, he would have lavish banquets and fiestas, growing ever more distant from the needs of his people and his kingdom. After all, if the peasants were starving, well, let them eat arroz con leche. He became extremely unpopular with his subjects, and his nobility began to despise him. Now, aside from a plunging approval rating, one of his biggest problems was that of succession. After 13 years with his first wife, he was unable to produce an heir, and so he married again. He took for his bride Joanna of Portugal, or anglicized Joan. The two were married in 1455 in Córdoba. She was the daughter of the King of Portugal and was described as being especially beautiful. It was also remarked that the only thing that surpassed her beauty was her sexual appetite. But despite that, it would be several more years before she would bear a child. Now, most historians agree that King Henry IV favored men. He surrounded himself with a charming, good-looking entourage. In particular was the king's favorite, a nobleman by the name of Beltrán de la Cueva, who would be given a seemingly endless amount of lands, titles, and money. Beltrán's sudden rise in status at the Castilian court would be a major source of contention with the rest of the nobility. Eyes were especially raised when King Henry and Beltrán would retire to the bedroom chamber together, and at times the Queen would join the two. As the years passed and no heir was produced, tensions escalated nearly to the breaking point. However, in 1462, the Queen gave birth to a daughter who was also called Joan. For the royal couple, it was a major sigh of relief. They had an heir at last. But then the accusations began. The nobility began to rally behind the idea that the heir to Castile, the Princess Joan, was illegitimate. She was given the slanderous nickname Joanna la Beltraneja, implying that Beltrán de la Cueva was the true father. For the King of Castile, his troubles were only about to explode. Henry IV now had to move quickly in order to maintain his throne. His nobility was increasingly eyeing his siblings as potential replacements for the crown. Henry's solution was to get his brother and sister out of the way as much as possible, that is, without actually having to kill them. Isabella, at this point, was a political pawn that could be married off. In 1457, when she was only 6, she was betrothed to Prince Ferdinand of Aragon. But this fell through the next year when a new king came to power in Aragon and looked to France rather than Castile as an ally. So, searching for a new ally himself, King Henry then negotiated a new deal. Downey portrays this well. Quote, In February of 1464, when Isabella was not quite 13, her brother Henry accepted the English offer and agreed to give her in marriage to King Edward IV. This at once would make Isabella a queen, that is, the Queen of England. It might have been a generous act on Henry's part to ensure an illustrious future for his half-sister. Certainly Isabella and Henry showed visible signs of affection from time to time. They did, after all, share some of the same interests: writing, music, hunting, etc. However, it is just as likely that the marital alliance was Henry's attempt to remove Isabella from the direct line of succession in Castile and relocate her to a distant land, especially at a time when rumors were brewing about his own daughter's legitimacy." End quote. The deal with the English would have been great, but later that same year it too fell apart when Edward IV disastrously decided to marry a lowly widow. Castile came out of this looking extremely foolish, and Isabella was infuriated that the English king had basically blown her off. Those around her knew that Isabella, due to the struggles of her early years, had become somewhat rigid and not one to forgive an insult. Some could argue that this was a character flaw, and others would perhaps say that this was a survival trait. In either case, Henry IV's search for a way to essentially get rid of Isabella would have to continue. "1463 found Isabella, now 13, on her way to Portugal to marry the King of Portugal, Afonso V, who was, well, 20 years older than she was. The proposal didn't go over well at all. Isabella refused to consent, and the Castilian nobility had finally had enough of the wayward king who couldn't even seem to keep his own household in order. Rallying behind the Archbishop of Toledo, a man named Alfonso Carrillo, and a high-ranking nobleman named Juan Pacheco, the aristocracy declared their split. In a document known as the Representation of Burgos, they listed their numerous grievances and demands. Some of the most prominent points were banishing Beltrán de la Cueva, questioning the illegitimacy of Princess Joan. The statement that they actually wrote down was rather blunt. "It is quite manifest that she is not the daughter of your highness." And the final major demand was that Henry IV had to acknowledge his younger half-brother, Alfonso, the Prince of Asturias, as the heir to Castile. Henry caved in to all demands and stated, "Know ye that to avoid any kind of scandal, I declare that the legitimate succession of this kingdom belongs to my brother, the Infante Don Alfonso, and to no other person whatsoever." The King of Castile was reduced to a laughingstock. Juan Pacheco alone would insult him in front of the court, but Henry couldn't take it for long. In an act of defiance, he backtracked on everything that he had previously agreed to. He first declared that his daughter was once again the only heir to Castile, and then, just to really tick everyone off, he brought Beltrán back to court and promoted him to the rank of Duke. The outcry was immediate. Castile fell into civil war. The nobility decided to rally themselves behind the young Don Alfonso, again King Henry's younger brother. Within a week, the cities of Burgos, Seville, Córdoba, and Toledo all rose up in rebellion against the king. Henry, with few other options, retreated to his stronghold in Segovia to figure out what to do next. Everybody else in the kingdom now had to pick a side. On June 5, 1465, in the town of Avila, the nobles of Castile came together and burned an effigy of Henry. When the king found out, he was horrified, and thus, when he was presented with another round of grievances and demands, he once again acquiesced. But it was during these negotiations, for the first time, that Isabella was brought to the forefront. One of the demands was that she should marry the detestable Pedro Girón, the master of the Order of Calatrava. The man was vulgar, and it was mentioned that he had even made advances on Isabella's mother. To Isabella's horror, the marriage was agreed upon. Pedro, by the way, was the brother of Juan Pacheco. The marriage, he calculated, would have given his descendants the chance to become royalty. But as Pedro was making his way to meet Isabella, he came down with a terrible infection and died quickly. It would seem that trying to marry Isabella off had gone from being difficult, to being a cause for civil war, to being a death sentence. The civil war would continue as Castile fell further into a dark age of violence. Lawlessness was the new normal, and everywhere there was pandemonium. In August of 1467, the forces of the king met up with the army of Prince Alfonso, now 13 years old, and his supporters in the nobility, who were essentially running the show. The ensuing conflict was called the Battle of Almedo. It was inconclusive except for the fact that King Henry fled the battlefield in humiliation. He went to a nearby village to wait out the fighting. When the word got out that the king had acted like such a coward, his most loyal supporters left him. Even the city of Segovia, his home base, now pledged its loyalty to Don Alfonso, who was increasingly looking like the next king. When the young prince arrived later in 1467 to claim the city under his banner, the inhabitants welcomed him in. Isabella, who had essentially been sequestered in the city, now had a very difficult decision to make. She could continue to support her older brother, King Henry, or back up her younger brother, Alfonso. In front of the people of Segovia, she ran up to Alfonso and embraced him. In that one act, she had placed her future and her life in the hands of her younger sibling. And perhaps she had a really good reason to think this way. Alfonso was regarded as a prodigy, one that could bring balance to the chaos that had engulfed the Kingdom of Castile. As the war continued, Alfonso made considerable gains. Meanwhile, Isabella was delighted. She basked in the glory of her younger brother's success. But this brief time of joy was not to last. It was in July of 1468. Brother and sister were enjoying a meal in a village near Avila called Cardenosa. They were on military campaign to secure the kingdom. A chronicler at the time recorded what happened next. Quote, "The king Don Alfonso was with his most serene highness the Princess Doña Isabella, his sister. As they sat at dinner, he was brought a trout pastry, which he partook of willingly. Afterwards, he fell into a heavy sleep and went off to bed without speaking to anyone, a thing he never did. Those of his bedchamber came and felt him with their hands, and noted that his body did not emanate any heat. As he did not awaken, they began to call loudly, and yet he did not respond. The physician, coming in haste, ordered him to be bled, but no blood came. His tongue was swollen and his mouth seemed black. With no remedy availing, the innocent king gave his soul on July 5, 1468. His death was believed to have been brought about by poisonous herbs." End quote. Whether it was sickness or an accident or murder by poison was up for debate. What was certain was the situation that Isabella found herself in. Her younger brother was dead. She had betrayed and rebelled against her older brother, the king. She had no supporters, no husband, and was perched precariously high in the order of succession. She was a target, and she was alone. Isabella was only 10 when word arrived that she and her brother had been ordered to go to the king's court in Segovia. Arevalo may have been a lonely outpost in the Kingdom of Castile, but it was the only home she had ever known. Everything familiar was there, including her mother, who at this point was in the depths of a profound depression. The Queen Mother at times would barely speak, only looking up to gaze upon her daughter with sad eyes. The young princess and her even younger brother had no choice but to comply with the king's command. The two children were taken from their mother and arrived at the Castilian court in 1462 to meet the king's new heir, who happened to be a girl and was given the name the Infanta Joana, but was later given the nickname La Beltraneja. This was a slur, created by the nobility as a declaration of her presumed illegitimacy. The royal court in Segovia was a politically dangerous place. Isabella was surrounded by the intrigue of the aristocracy, people that had motives and agendas, and not always were they in line with the good of the royal family. Isabella would take solace in the words of her astute grandmother, Isabel of Barcelos, which guided her through this dark hour of her life. "Composure, child. Observe first, and let your reactions come from a place of control." These words would forever echo in her mind. It was now 6 years later, and Castile was in the middle of a civil war. Isabella, who at this point was 16 years old, had backed up her younger brother Alfonso in a rebellion against her older brother, King Henry IV. But then everything had gone very wrong in the blink of an eye. She was now brought into the chamber where the corpse of her younger brother Alfonso resided. She knew, looking at her deceased sibling, that she had lost the civil war. Gazing upon him, or at least what was left of him, she repressed her intense sadness. Instead, her mind went to work calculating her next move. Composure, child. Observe first. The tongue was bloated and black. The skin showed signs of dehydration, and yet nobody else was sick. This couldn't have been plague or infection, as everybody else was calling it. Her articulate mind knew right away he was poisoned, he was murdered. The real question was by whom? She thought back for a moment. What was it that the Roman orator Cicero would say? Cui bono? Who would benefit most? King Henry IV first came to mind, but she doubted that her older brother was capable of fratricide. Closing her eyes, she began to think of the nobility. After shuffling through the pantheon, eventually her mind settled on Juan Pacheco. He was a nobleman of immense prestige, the Marquis of Villena and Master of the Order of Santiago, someone who would stop at nothing to seize more power. In the past, he had arranged for his vile brother Pedro Giron to marry Isabella, a ploy, by the way, that would have put his family in line to take the throne. More importantly, several years prior, he had led the charge to depose King Henry IV and install the Prince Alfonso as the new ruler. There were rumors that he felt that he could control the prince much better. But despite his ruthless ambition, Juan Pacheco was known to have shifting loyalties. Isabella's mind raced. Perhaps he had lost faith in the young Alfonso. Perhaps he felt he could control the king with more authority now. If he had changed sides to back up the king once again and had plotted to kill Alfonso, he would likely strike again if her brother's death was exposed as a murder. Who would he kill next? Would it be her older brother, King Henry, this time? Or would it be the next in line to rule, meaning herself? Composure, child. Let your reactions come from a place of control. Looking up from the body of her younger brother, she announced to all around her, "This was the work of the plague. My poor brother was unable to resist the sickness. There is nothing more for us to do now than simply mourn this unfortunate accident." These words were acknowledged by the kingdom and then the rest of the nobility. But then the demands began to come in. Juan Pacheco wanted to take the princess into his own personal custody to protect her from the plague, of course. He immediately suggested that Isabella marry King Alfonso of Portugal right away. The Archbishop of Toledo, who had grown extremely wary of Juan Pacheco, countered. He suggested that Isabella instead should marry Ferdinand of Aragon. Now keep in mind that the demands of these two men, while coming from places of contempt and a sense of protection, respectively, would have removed Isabella from the line of succession. Then there were also the remaining supporters of Isabella's younger brother Alfonso, who demanded that she continue the rebellion against King Henry. The city of Seville had even gone so far as to declare her queen. So what would it be? Exile in marriage, or destruction in a disastrous civil war? Isabella had held her composure, she had observed well, and her reaction came from a place of control. She declared that the rebellion was over, that she would be loyal to the king, her older brother, once again, if he would have it so. But her statement also came with her own demands. She was recalled as saying, quote, "Return the kingdom to King Henry, my brother, and thus you will restore peace to Castile. But if you hold me daughter the King John, my lord and father, and worthy of the name, have the king my brother declare me to be the successor to the realm. This I will take as the greatest service you can render me. So long as King Henry may live, I will not take over the government, nor will I call myself queen. But I will make every effort to the end that King Henry, while he lives, may govern this realm better than he has done." End quote. Oh, and one more thing. Part of the agreement, and a smart move at that, also stated that Isabella would never have to marry against her will. Now the ball was in King Henry's court. It was up to him to decide what to do next. To be completely fair, this really wasn't so much a gamble for Isabella. She knew her brother's personality well and surmised what his response would be. King Henry agreed. He wanted peace. Juan Pacheco, on the other hand, was both shocked and angry. It quickly dawned on him that he had been outmaneuvered by a teenager. In August of 1468, an agreement was reached. Peace would be restored to the land. Henry would be the undisputed king, but at the same time, Isabella was now the heir to Castile, and no one could tell her who to marry. Meanwhile, as Isabella was securing her spot in the line of succession, King Henry's wife, the beautiful Joan of Portugal, had been, busy herself. While the Castilian king was off and away, engaged in the civil war, the queen, and I should emphasize, separated from him, had given birth again. There was no dispute now. This new child was illegitimate. Henry was beyond angry, and understandably so. He immediately renounced his daughter Joanna la Beltraneja's claim to the crown, and then he had his wife, Joan of Portugal, banished from court. For a very brief moment, Isabella took in a breath of relief. Initially, things began to fall in line for Isabella. She found herself for the next 9 months in Ocaña, where she surrounded herself with loyal supporters. As she expanded her base of followers, her brother, the king, bestowed upon her the vaunted title, Princess of Asturias. This title implied that she would be the next in line to rule, but the name Asturias itself held meaning beyond just the political realm. It was the name of the first Christian kingdom to emerge in the wake of the Islamic conquest in the early 8th century. It was in this northernmost part of Iberia that the Reconquista was said to have begun, with Don Pelayo's victory at the Battle of Covadonga. Thus, for Isabella, this wasn't just simply a title, but the call to become a holy warrior, something that she would definitely take to heart. The now Princess of Asturias was also given jurisdiction over territories, including the revenues from places such as Medina del Campo, a wealthy trading center. Along the same lines, Isabella began to correspond with other nobles and oversee royal events. In essence, she was grooming herself to lead. However, it was not long before she would face problems. As soon as her rebel army had disbanded, King Henry began to hold back on his promises, mainly guided by Juan Pacheco, whose hatred of the young princess was at this point common knowledge. Henry began to cut off revenue from cities that were otherwise promised to Isabella. He also began to be swayed by Joan of Portugal, his wife, still in exile, mind you, to reinstate his daughter as heir. And if that was not enough, the king also began to pressure Isabella to marry outside the kingdom once again. The first suitor to show up was Richard of England, the younger brother of Edward IV. If you recall, Edward had rejected Isabella in the past, so it wasn't really much of a surprise when the deal fell through. But don't feel bad. In historical retrospective, Isabella had dodged the proverbial bullet on this one. This Richard that we're talking about would one day be Richard III, who, for those not familiar, he would enter into the winter of his discontent, destined to meet a rather nasty end at the Battle of Bosworth Field, after his country had erupted into a horrendous civil war. Richard was to be the last of the Plantagenet line, and many in his royal family were, to say this nicely, purged as the Tudor dynasty came to power. For the Castilian king, it would be back to the drawing board. On April 30th, 1469, Henry IV had entered into negotiations with Afonso V of Portugal again in an attempt to marry his sister off. The terms of the deal seemed a little desperate. Part of the agreement was that Afonso could call himself Prince of Asturias, if you recall how important that was. And here's the best part. If Isabella refused, the Portuguese would be given the green light to declare war on Isabella. To call it a strong-arm approach would be a bit of an understatement. Isabella, however, would have nothing to do with this. You see, as her brother the king had been scheming to accomplish his own ends, she had been scheming to accomplish her own ends. Unknown to King Henry, Isabella this entire time had been making plans to get married on her own. The national pastime of the neighboring kingdom of Aragon was to figure out a way to take over Castile. It was an obsession with the Aragonese kings. They just needed to figure out a way to do it. They tried military options, then diplomatic means, then they tried to marry their way in. The King of Aragon at this time was John II. The man was an empire builder. In 1419, John had married the Queen of Navarre, Blanca, or Blanche, I. When she died in 1441, he declared himself the King of Navarre. King John II now held power in the lands of Navarre, Aragon, Valencia, and Catalonia, but the man always wanted just a little more, and looked at Castile with greedy eyes. John and Blanca I had 3 children, Carlos, Blanca II, and Eleanor. Blanca II, again anglicized Blanche, was sent to Castile to become Henry IV's first wife. It was kind of a requirement of a peace treaty between the two kingdoms. King John II now had exactly what he wanted. All he had to do was await for his daughter to produce an heir for King Henry IV so he could make a better claim to add Castile to his domain. Simple enough, right? King John waited a year, then a decade, and then longer. But as fate would have it, Henry IV and Blanche II, despite 13 years of marriage, produced no heir, and the marriage was eventually annulled. Blanche was sent home in disgrace and essentially imprisoned by her family for, lack of a better phrase, failure to act. Eventually, she was even poisoned. King John II of Aragon would have to try again. At the age of 54, he decided to remarry. He chose a 19-year-old noblewoman by the name of Juana Enriquez. They ended up having 2 children, a daughter named Juana, and then an especially dashing young man named Ferdinand, who was born in 1452. Ferdinand would quickly become the king's favorite, which would strain the relations with his other children. His wife, Queen Juana, didn't help the situation. She was quite the spiteful, evil stepmother to the other kids. John II's oldest son, Carlos, began to resent his father. He reasserted himself, opposed his father, and claimed the kingdom for himself, which, granted, was kind of his birthright, but this was quasi-civil war. The kingdom of Aragon became divided as to who should hold power, King John II or his son, Carlos. The infighting of the royal family was intense. At one point, Carlos was even imprisoned by his own father. However, this brought the country to the brink of civil war, which was led by the people of Catalonia, who had backed up Carlos. In order to bring peace, King John was forced to release his son and declared him to be his heir. But shortly after this declaration, on September 23, 1461, Carlos died suddenly in Barcelona. Poison was suspected, and it was his own stepmother, the Queen Juana, who was the prime suspect. Therefore, in one swift blow, King John's favorite, some would say most controllable son, Ferdinand, at the age of 9, had become the heir of Aragon. King John II, the sovereign of Aragon, now had another chance to take over his neighbor by marriage. But King Henry IV of Castile was well aware of the ambitions of the King of Aragon, who by the way had gained the nickname the Faithless. As a result, Henry just simply outright forbade Isabella to marry Ferdinand. But by 1469, Isabella, now 18, had decided it was Ferdinand who she would wed regardless. She was recounted as saying it has to be he and no other. Thus, the two went to work to make this happen. As Ferdinand and Isabella were second cousins, they had to get a special dispensation from the Pope to make the marriage legal. This was a super important point, as otherwise their kids would be deemed illegitimate. King Henry IV and Juan Pacheco, meanwhile, had moved to tighten their control over the princess. They tried to confine her to one spot, watched her every move, and even bribed her ladies-in-waiting to spy on her. However, Isabella caught on to this and figured out a way to get one step ahead. In early August of 1469, she declared she was going to visit her brother's tomb in Arevalo. But as soon as she and her entourage had made it over the horizon, she made a run for it. Isabella made her way in haste from one small town to another, hiding in a convent at one point. Eventually, on August 30th, 1469, she and a few companions arrived at her destination in Valladolid. Ferdinand, too, had a difficult journey. He crossed the Castilian border in the middle of the night with an entourage of 5 trusted companions. He traveled disguised as a mule driver, making his way through remote mountain passes, and arrived the day before Isabella did. Now, the two of them had corresponded back and forth for some time, and when they met, there was no disappointment, but there was some major encanto. On October 19, 1469, in the Great Hall of Valladolid, the two were married. Downey picks up the tale. Quote, "Their family histories may have been tangled, but one aspect of the young couple's early life together was simple and self-evident: their chemistry. They had seen each other for the first time on October 14, 1469. They were married within the week. And 3 months later, Isabella was pregnant." King Henry's infertility had been a source of shame and worry for the nation, but Isabella had proven her own fruitfulness in a remarkably short time. Observers noted with satisfaction that the relationship appeared to be both warm and passionate. Both were strong and physically fit, energetic and decisive. Isabella was the more intellectual of the two, enjoying the company of scholars and people of romantic temperament. Ferdinand was a man of action with great personal charm. Isabella was eager to have a child, and Ferdinand was, well, happy to do his part to make it happen. In addition to their physical bond, the two teenagers had much in common. They were both Spaniards, inoculated from birth with the same beliefs about their nation's history, destiny, and challenges. Furthermore, Ferdinand and Isabella had psychological and emotional similarities as well. They had both been raised in the shadow of older siblings who were expected to rule. Both had grown up surrounded by war and civil unrest, which made them feel exposed and vulnerable to danger even as children. As a result, both were determined to bring to the job of governing the kind of determination that had previously been lacking." End quote. Now, despite the happiness that the new couple was enjoying, there was one in the kingdom who was decidedly unhappy. When King Henry IV got the news of the wedding, he was furious. Isabella attempted to contact him to reconcile things, but the king's responses were few and malicious when they came, and perhaps understandably so. Guided by Juan Pacheco, the King of Castile went to work to undermine his half-sister with everything he had. He began to align the nobility against Isabella, with noted effect. Her support in the Castilian court began to fall apart. Henry then cut off as many sources of income for the couple as he could, and then, after that, he got really nasty. It was suddenly discovered that the papal dispensation that Isabella and Ferdinand had received to get married was no longer viable. Thus, any offspring that they had would not only be illegitimate, but they would never be heir to the kingdom. Isabella got this news just days before she went into labor with her first child, a birth, by the way, that she barely survived. Shortly thereafter, on October 26, 1470, King Henry formally disinherited Isabella. He renounced her claim to the throne and announced that his daughter, Joanna la Beltraneja, would once again be his heir. For Isabella, this was a truly dark time. She was impoverished, disinherited, recovering from a dangerous childbirth, and had also learned that her new husband had been unfaithful. But despite all this, she was determined to get it all back. The only question was how. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia was born in 1431 in a small town near Valencia. His first language was Catalan. In time, he'd be considered a Spaniard. He came from a rich, powerful, affluent family. Indeed, his uncle was a pope. Growing up in the Renaissance, the man had an affection for the indulgences of both the mind and the body, which is a nice way of saying that he just couldn't seem to resist temptation, and on more than one occasion, his colleagues would ask him to tone it down a bit. But the man also had a lot of power and just happened to be in the right place at the right time. With his influence, a close friend of his was elected into the papacy. His buddy became Pope Sixtus IV. This pope, by the way, would go on to establish the Vatican records, upgraded Rome, and built the Sistine Chapel. Not bad indeed. As it just so happened, the Ottoman Turks, at this point in history, were making some major gains in Europe. In 1472, Rodrigo was sent back home to Iberia to recruit some help. One of his first stops was the Kingdom of Aragon. Here he met King John II and his son Ferdinand, who happened to be home visiting. The three men hit it off famously. For them, it was a big fiesta. It was during this time that the cardinal was convinced by Ferdinand to travel to Alcalá de Henares, a place that Isabella had turned into her base of operations. Rodrigo Borgia was entranced with the princess. He found her motivation to be inspirational. Isabella, after all, had been working relentlessly since the birth of her first child 2 years prior to re-establish her power base. She had already convinced the Archbishop of Toledo to join her, and had brought many nobles to her side with promises of lands and titles. The fact that her brother, the king, was doing such a poor job, and had allowed chaos and massive civil strife to consume the Kingdom of Castile, only helped her cause. Isabella was enamored by the cardinal, especially his intellect and his insight into art and culture. What's more, the two saw each other as being powerful political partners for the future. Thus, when Rodrigo returned to Rome, he remained fascinated by the princess and her husband, so much so that he used his influence to re-establish their marriage papal dispensation. Suddenly, Isabella and Ferdinand had powerful backers in the Vatican, and their children could once again inherit the realm. The eyes of the aristocracy began to look at the couple more and more as the true sovereigns. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia would one day be the scandalous Pope Alexander VI. Folks, look him up. This man would turn Rome into his own private house of pleasure. But despite all of his hedonism and crass behavior, he would never forget Isabella. The princess had done much to regain her power and prestige. Now she had to take on a much bigger task: reconciliation. It was a cold day on December 29th, 1473, but something extraordinary was about to happen. After 4 long years, King Henry IV and Isabella had agreed to meet in Segovia. The tension between brother and sister was high. There was, after all, much unresolved animosity. Now, why King Henry IV agreed to do this is still up for debate. Clearly, his most trusted advisor, Juan Pacheco, had strenuously objected to the meeting. One argument was that the king had his back against the wall. Castile had descended into a lawless kingdom. Murder, rape, theft was rampant. As such, the nobility had shifted even more to Isabella's side. That said, everybody expected the siblings to fail in their negotiations. But once again, Isabella held her composure. Her responses came from a place of control. Kristen Downey describes the scene, quote, "When at last the reunion between Henry and Isabella occurred, the angry feelings dissipated in moments. Despite all the animosity of the previous years, brother and sister were genuinely pleased to see each other. Henry was in a happy mood, having just returned from a hunting trip, and Isabella was waiting for him in the Alcazar, where she welcomed him with grave humility. He greeted her with delight and embraced her lovingly. The two wandered off to a nearby room where they sat down together. She swore her loyalty, apologized for having offended him, and asked him to please consider the good consequences for Castile of her marriage to Ferdinand." End quote. In the subsequent days, the warmth in the royal household only improved further. Ferdinand was invited and formally introduced to King Henry, who was warm in reception. New Year's was a joyous time, and everybody in the kingdom was shocked at just how well things were going. Perhaps in their reconciliation, there was some hope for the kingdom after all. But not all were content. Forces were at work against the reunion already. On January 9th, 1474, during a lavish meal, King Henry unexpectedly fell ill. He lost all his energy and began to have horrendous stomach pain. His lips started to turn black. Isabella had seen this before with her younger brother, but before she could say anything, Juan Pacheco suddenly appeared and accused Isabella of poisoning the king. He demanded that Henry arrest her immediately. The king thought about it, but refused to do so. But Juan Pacheco's accusation had had its effect. Henry would never again fully trust his sister, and the two departed on poor terms. Over the next year, Henry's health and stamina failed. He relegated more and more authority to Juan Pacheco, who in turn attempted to undermine Isabella with everything he had. Pacheco during this time gained considerable power, and his animosity towards the princess had reached a climax. There are even some that say that he was going to imprison or assassinate her. Fate, however, would intervene. On October 4th, 1474, Juan Pacheco came down with what historians called a throat infection. His death came surprisingly quick. Some could argue that the man might have been poisoned. But again, posterity recorded this as a simple infection. History, after all, is written by the victor, whoever she might be. Juan Pacheco's death was a serious blow to Henry. The king's health spiraled, it plummeted downwards, and he would never recover. King Henry IV took his last breath in the early morning hours of December 11th, 1474. It was said that on his deathbed he declared his daughter, Joanna la Beltraneja, now 13, to be his heir. However, no will could be found. The throne of Castile was now vacant. Isabella now had a fleeting moment in history to take it all, but the path was extremely dangerous. Portugal would want Castile. It would lay claim via King Henry's wife and daughter. Aragon could likewise claim it through Ferdinand. Castile, after all, per law, needed a king, and no woman had ruled it in over 200 years. If the Castilian princess was to take the crown, she'd be risking all-out war with both of her neighbors. And as this would also be seen as a coup, she'd be risking a massively destructive civil war in a kingdom that was already on the verge of disintegrating. To many, this would have been too serious of a challenge, a suicide mission even. But for Isabella, this was an opportunity. Her moment of destiny had arrived. She was going to seize the throne of Castile for herself, or die in the process. A cold wind blew across the field as the two armies stared down upon one another. Like so many times before in history, when one ruler died and their throne was contested, it would take bloodshed to determine who would come next to power. The War of Castilian Succession, as it would be known, was about to reach its climax. March 1st, 1476 was a miserable day, cold, overcast, and at times even foggy. The battlefield was destined to be located near the town of Toro in the fertile lands northwest of Madrid. On one side was the aging Afonso V, the King of Portugal, who had led his men in this invasion of Castile. He assumed the center position of his impressive army, numbering approximately 8,500 men. His 21-year-old son, John II, commanded his left flank, which was composed of his elite troops known as the Chevalier. Prince John also had under his command soldiers who possessed weapons that were opening a new and much more destructive chapter in the history of warfare. They possessed the arquebus. That is, they were using firearms en masse supported by cannon. Afonso V's right flank was composed of not just Portuguese soldiers, but many members of the Castilian nobility who had defected to his cause. These noblemen were championed by Alfonso Carrillo, the Archbishop of Toledo, who had gone renegade and had come to the side of the Portuguese king. Afonso V had come in force to support Joana la Beltraneja's claim to the throne. She was the daughter, albeit some called her the illegitimate daughter of Henry IV, the deceased King of Castile who had died only a year and a half prior. Opposing them on the other end of the battlefield was the army of Castile, which numbered 8,000. Its right flank was composed of light cavalry supported by infantry under Álvaro de Mendoza, a member of a powerful noble house of Castile. The left flank held knights in heavy armor under the Duke of Alba and Cardinal Mendoza. In the center, the Castilians had a very strong line composed of the Royal Guard. It was led by Ferdinand, the heir to the crown of Aragon. Ferdinand was no stranger to warfare, and he, too, had come in force. His loyalty was to his queen and to her claim to the Castilian throne. This fight was to ensure that his queen would be known to all as Queen Isabella of Castile. Her claim, however, was in serious jeopardy, and as the two armies began to move in for the attack, Ferdinand knew that everything rested in the outcome of this battle. But despite his devotion and the strength of arms under his command, the road that had led to this war and now to the Battle of Toro, as it would be known, was one of the most difficult and harrowing ordeals that Ferdinand and Isabella had ever faced. A year and a half prior, on December 11th, 1474, King Henry IV of Castile had died in Segovia. Isabella was near her older brother when he passed. His death caused her to have mixed emotions. Their relationship, after all, had transcended the spectrum from love to hate. In front of all to see, Isabella professed her sadness and donned mourning attire. But at the same time, it was clear that she had anticipated this moment for some time. She was ready to act and use the element of surprise for all it was worth. After all, not many outside of Segovia knew that the king had just died. The day after Henry passed, funeral services were held throughout Segovia. The bells of the church of San Miguel began ringing, and soon all the churches in the city chimed in. The very next day, December 13th, 1474, it was Isabella's turn to cross her own Rubicon. As they would say, la suerta está echada. She appeared before her people in a long procession throughout the city. Her clothes of mourning had been replaced by the most resplendent of attire, indicating high nobility. She wasn't just emphasizing her claim to the throne, she was establishing her image of a ruler with dignity and poise, ordained to lead by divinity. Now, the preparations for this day must have taken months. From the jewels that decorated her dress, to the influential members of the city that comprised her procession, to the sword that her official who led the line had raised straight up, a sign of formidable strength. All the details of this day had been planned with intensity. The procession slowly made its way to the Cathedral of Segovia. There she was crowned, and soon after emerged to her people as Queen Isabella. Make no mistake, this was a coup. She was usurping power, and it was a profound act. No woman had been sole ruler of Castile-Leon since the days of Queen Berenguela in 1217, over 250 years prior. But before anyone could protest, she spoke to her people with distinction, swearing to look out for the common good, to bring justice to the land, to protect the nobility, and above all else, to be a defender of the faith. She asked for their loyalty, and the request was received with passionate applause. Isabella then brought forth her 4-year-old daughter, Isabel, and raising her up, she declared her to be the next heiress to the throne. It was another profound act. Isabella had just declared that a female had the right to be the successor to the crown, not just with her ascension, but also in the future. This precedent that she had just established, by the way, would have lasting effects that would reverberate not just throughout Iberian history, but throughout world history. That night, many of the great royal houses arrived and announced their loyalty to the new queen. This included the Mendozas, a significantly powerful family of Castile. As an aside, Isabella had worked with Rodrigo Borgia, destined to be pope one day, to elevate one of the Mendoza to the status of cardinal. Their loyalty to her would be the price. Isabella made it a point to sleep in the royal palace of Segovia that evening, as the people of the city continued to enjoy the fanfare which went on well into the night. However, even though she had seized power and was considered the queen by some, not all would be happy with her actions. Ferdinand was in Zaragoza, the capital of Aragon, when he heard the news a week later. Those around him at the time attested that he became insanely enraged and traveled to Segovia to see what his wife had done. As he made the week-long journey, he had time to think about how he would play this out. Reason would win out to wrath. On January 2nd, 1475, he entered Segovia in style, dressed in his finest, his entourage flanking his grand entrance. Isabella had planned for his entrance to be a spectacle. She knew she had to win him over quickly. Kristen Downey in the book The Warrior Queen takes up the tale. Quote, Ferdinand traveled in procession to the Alcazar, where he found Isabella waiting for him inside the gates. Suddenly, their roles were reversed. She was in control. Now he would come to her, not she to him. She was proceeding according to legal precedents established by previous queens. However, Isabella's ascension had seemed something of a theoretical possibility. It was viewed as plausible that a woman would rule in her own right. But it was quite shocking in reality. Male dominance was so customary that even Isabella's supporters were perplexed and confused. What Isabella had done was not unprecedented, but it was highly irregular." End quote. Now, in front of everyone in the Alcazar, the two acted with distinction and reverence for one another. But as soon as they were alone, the mood changed dramatically. Ferdinand flew into a rage, demanding an explanation of how his wife could act so erratically, so foolishly. Why would she do this to undermine him? In the book, The Queen's Vow, the author C.W. Gortner, I feel, captures Isabella's response perfectly. Keep in mind this is written as historical fiction, but nonetheless, quote, "You did not consult me," he interrupted. "You did not even write to ask what I thought. You declared yourself queen and had the sword of justice carried before you. You made it seem as if there were no other monarchs here but you." I stared at him, outraged. After all these weeks of uncertainty, of working myself to exhaustion in meetings, seeking to shore up Castile while he was fighting in France, surely he did not expect my sympathy. But then I spied in his expression a fleeting vulnerability in his eyes. With a sinking of my heart, I recognized the emotion: fear. Ferdinand was afraid. He thought I wanted to keep him from having as much power as me, and he would be left exposed to the derision of my court, the Aragonese who bedded the queen but had no right in how she ruled. His pride of manhood was injured. Relief flooded me. This was something I could deal with. End quote. On one end, it would have seemed that the marriage of Castile and Aragon was in crisis. Ferdinand definitely saw himself one day as being the king. However, Isabella had no plans to give her husband control over lands. She had something else in mind. She convinced him that her power was essentially just in spirit, ephemeral, that he would not lose any of his potency as sovereign. Furthermore, Isabella emphasized that if he was to undermine her, he'd be putting their heir, a female, into question as to whether or not she could one day rule as well. Isabella then went on to find one means after another to soothe her husband. Eventually, a contract known as the Concordat of Segovia was created, which outlined their roles. For example, both of their names would appear in all documents and coins, albeit his would go first. This gave the illusion that he was the one dictating the policy of the land. In fact, Ferdinand would often get the credit and the accolade for progressive changes that were truly the work and genius of his wife. This was another masterstroke on Isabella's part. The queen knew her husband. He was more a man of action and was not always keen on being bogged down by bureaucracy. Plus, Ferdinand was not really good at Latin, the language of legal code. Isabella, on the other hand, threw herself into an intense study of the language, so she would be just as proficient as any of her counselors. When it came to establishing legal codes or treaties or important documents, nothing was going to get past her. Indeed, she even made all of her children learn Latin so that they would also be in that commanding position. It was an interesting compromise. Ferdinand had maintained his dignity, but at the same time, Isabella held her ground. She would go on to govern Castile and create its laws essentially as a sole sovereign, but even after she alone established a new decree or code, she would say, "Póngase rey y reina," that is, sign it king and queen. The two were able to somehow make it work. The delicate balance of Castile and Aragon would hold together. But even as Isabella and Ferdinand got accustomed to their new roles, they were now going to face an even greater challenge. In early 1475, they got word that Portugal had invaded with a strong army. The War of Castilian Succession had begun. The King of Portugal was a proud and ambitious man who had always wanted Castile. He at one point intended to marry Isabella and take his prize of the Castilian throne, but the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella had destroyed that possibility. So what he could not take with matrimony, he decided to take with war. When King Henry IV of Castile died, his daughter and heir, Joanna la Beltraneja, was brought to Portugal. Castile was then divided into those that supported Isabella and those that supported Joanna as the next ruler. Afonso V, the 50-year-old King of Portugal, jumped at this opportunity. He married the young Joana la Beltraneja, aged 13 and also his niece, and then rallied the nobles of Castile that opposed Isabella to join his side. Finally, with his army amassed, he invaded Castile in May of 1475. He claimed he was there to put Joana, the rightful heir, back on the throne. The Portuguese king had over 10,000 men supported by cavalry and artillery. As he made his way, he spent vast sums of money to bribe the Castilian aristocracy. Even Alfonso Carrillo, the Archbishop of Toledo, decided to join the Portuguese camp. The Archbishop, by the way, who at one point had been a very strong supporter of Isabella, had now become unhappy. He had been overlooked. If you recall, a member of the Mendoza family was chosen to become cardinal instead of him. Isabella did not take this invasion of her land lightly. Ferdinand took direct control of the troops while she handled logistics. She then traveled all across the kingdom, raising funds and rallying her people. She demanded that they should, quote, make war by fire and by blood against the King of Portugal. For most of 1475, the two forces would meet only in skirmishes. The Portuguese, however, were able to make gains and captured several cities and castles along the lower Duero Valley. This included the important castle of Toro, which would serve as a forward base. To make matters worse, Afonso V had made an alliance with the French, who he expected would open up a second front, but they never did. That all said, one of the major advantages that Isabella and Ferdinand had was the fact that the longer the war dragged out, the less support Afonso V would have. His inability to deliver a crushing blow on Castile made him look weak. Afonso renewed his offensive in February of 1476. He was reinforced by his son, John II. The two laid siege to Zamora, where Ferdinand and his army had barricaded themselves in. The siege lasted for approximately 2 weeks, but the Portuguese army, exposed to the harsh winter, suffered tremendously, and so demoralized and exhausted on March 1st, they withdrew to the castle of Toro. Ferdinand, sensing an opportunity, launched his men in pursuit. About 3 miles from Toro, the two forces met. On this wet, dismal day, March 1st, 1476, near the banks of the Duero River, the two armies moved in for the kill. Prince John II of Portugal, with his elite troops, launched an all-out attack on the Castilian right flank. The fighting was intense. The prince showed his skill on the battlefield and kept his men organized in one cohesive fighting unit. This pulverized his opponent and drove it back. Screaming, "St. George! St. George!" the Portuguese demolished the Castilian right flank and the men in that line began to flee. However, Prince John was not able to exploit his early victory. Looking down the line, he saw that the rest of the Portuguese army was not doing very well at all. Masterfully, the prince decided to hold his men back and maintain his formation. He wanted to keep his men from getting isolated and disorganized. On the other end of the battlefield, Castile was winning. The Castilian elite troops under Cardinal Mendoza and the Duke of Alba had pushed the Portuguese decisively back. And in the center, Ferdinand's royal guard had inflicted major casualties. The fighting, especially around the Portuguese royal standard, had become extremely chaotic. In the middle of that intense fight, the standard bearer had had his hand sliced off, and so he moved the flag to his other hand, which was also promptly hacked off. And so, in order to keep the Portuguese flag upright, he used his teeth. That is, of course, until he bled to death. Now, seeing the royal standard fall, Afonso V lost his nerve. It was said that he threw himself into the fight to welcome death. However, at the very last second, he was held back by his men from becoming a bloody casualty. But as the Portuguese king was brought to the back of his formation, he watched as the Castilians crushed his center and flank. The Portuguese line then faltered and many broke and ran. Some of his men retreated only to drown in the Duero River that was behind them. The fighting across the entire battlefield at this point devolved into a massive brawl. Casualties mounted on both sides, and it was only the coming of night that brought an end to hostilities. From a military perspective, the Battle of Toro was inconclusive. The Castilians had lost on their right flank, but had won with their left. Prince John II of Portugal held the field after the fighting, but the Portuguese king had been withdrawn, albeit in good order. Both sides would go on to declare victory, but first-hand accounts of what actually happened during the fighting vary depending on which chronicler you read. However, one thing was certain: Isabella turned this into a political triumph. After all, it was clear that Afonso V and his Portuguese army were unable to deliver a quick victory. At least not on land. The Portuguese navy would triumph over the Castilian navy, winning Portugal major concessions later. Regardless, as long as Isabella and Ferdinand could resist, Joana la Beltraneja's claim to the Castilian throne seemed less legitimate. Many of the Castilian nobility that had followed Afonso now changed sides. Even the French refused to help the Portuguese king, at least not in force. In fact, Ferdinand, in an impressive move, even sent troops to occupy Navarre to prevent French aggression in that area. The Portuguese were not done. They would remain on Castilian soil for the next 3 years. Even up to February of 1479, the Portuguese would send in an army to take Mérida. But 1479 would prove to be a decisive year. In that year, the army that Portugal had sent in was defeated. What's more, the Pope annulled the dispensation that allowed Afonso V to initially marry Joana la Beltraneja. Again, she was his niece. With that one papal move, Afonso V had lost all legitimacy in this war, and for that matter, any chance of taking the Castilian throne. Peace between Portugal and Castile would finally come in September of 1479. Despite years of warfare, the terms were relatively lenient. Both sides would recognize each other's sovereignty. Afonso would give up his bid for Castile, and Joana la Beltraneja was allowed to enter into a convent and thus remove herself from the line of succession. Due to Portugal's naval victories, this treaty allowed Castile to keep the Canary Islands, but gave Portugal free rein to take anything south of those islands, meaning that they could take just about anything in Africa, and that area would now be off-limits to Castile. Remember this. This would be a very important point. This major concession would make Isabella and Ferdinand much more inclined to fund expeditions across the Atlantic to look for new lands to conquer. This is a point that we will definitely get back to later. For now, things were going very well for the royal couple. On February 20th, 1479, King John II of Aragon died. Ferdinand was now the recognized king of the crowns of Castile and Aragon, amongst many other territories. As his wife had done when she became queen, Ferdinand now also signed the paperwork to make her an equal co-ruler of all their combined lands. While Castile and Aragon would still have their own governing bodies, they were now essentially one massive, powerful state. Isabella now threw herself into the promises that she had made to her people when she became queen. The church and the aristocracy were both vigorously reformed. Corruption in the government was addressed. The queen replaced incompetent administrators with a meritocracy. A police force was created to bring criminals to justice under a new and much more rigorous legal code. Galicia, which was essentially ruled by thieves, was brought under control in 1481 in a prolonged campaign that crushed opposition. Isabella then shut down the practice of overproducing nearly worthless coins, replacing it with a currency that had merit. The economy as a result flourished. Money began to just flow in. The Catholic monarchs, as they'd be known, used this to start a vast building program. Ferdinand also set to work expanding and improving the army and navy, equipping it with the latest weapons. He established strong points and was able to secure the borders. Finally, the royal couple went to work creating a vast system of alliances through their children. Each one of their children, male or female, was brought up with an intense focus on education and was groomed to take a leading role wherever they went. Their eldest daughter, Isabel, was married to Prince Afonso of Portugal, not to be confused with Afonso V. This would cement an alliance with their Iberian neighbor. Their only son, John, and their second daughter, Joanna, were both married into the powerful Habsburg family, to Margaret of Austria and Philip the Handsome, respectively. Their third daughter, Maria, would also be married into the Portuguese royal house. And finally, the youngest daughter would be sent to England to secure an alliance. Her name, by the way, was Catherine. This princess would have books written about her. She would be known to history as Catherine of Aragon. Isabella and Ferdinand had accomplished so much. The economy, the government, the military were all restored. The Portuguese were no longer enemies, and a strong system of alliances with the major powers of Europe were underway. Despite all this, Isabella did not feel complete. She first and foremost saw herself as a defender of the faith, a new Joan of Arc. Isabella now felt compelled to start a new war, one that would allow her to accomplish what all the prior kings of Castile could not. To some, this new conflict would be regarded as the Queen's War. Its objective was crystal clear. Isabella was going to end the Reconquista and destroy the last kingdom of Islam. We have not been moved to this war by any desire to enlarge our realms. Our desire to serve God and His faith made us put aside all other interests for this cause, hoping only that the Holy Catholic faith will be quit of so constant a danger at our very doorsteps. These infidels of the Kingdom of Granada must be uprooted and cast out from Spain. The borderlands between Castile and Al-Andalus, as the Muslims called it, was a violent and lawless place. On December 26th, the day after Christmas in 1481, Nasrid riders took to the field and crossed the border into Castile. Their goal eventually came into sight, Zahara, a town in the foothills of the Great Southern Range of Iberia. In what was remembered as a stormy, rainy, dark night, the warriors of the Nasrid Sultan Abu al-Hassan descended on, attacked, and ravaged Zahara. This was a reprisal for Castilian raids. The attack was meant to prove one thing: the treaty that had held the uneasy peace was now broken. It was later said by Arab historians that the Christians were terrorized and without any hope of rescue. A great number were killed by being slashed by swords. The rest were captured and marched off. Abu al-Hassan returned to Granada, very satisfied and content with the good outcome of his venture. This was no ordinary raid. Zahara was not just raided, it was occupied, reinforced, and then used as a forward base. Cities like Jaén, Seville, Córdoba, and many others would now come under attack, if for no other reason than there was very little to oppose the Muslims. The fall of Zahara was one of the final straws in the escalating violence between the kingdoms of Castile and Granada. In the past, the Christian kingdoms in the north, Castile-Leon, Aragon, and Portugal, had grown in power. Through centuries of on-and-off fighting, the Muslims of Iberia were driven back. Even their North African reinforcements, the veiled Almoravid, the ascetic Almohad, and the powerful Marinid, were defeated one by one. Under the warrior kings like Sancho I of Portugal, Ferdinand III of Castile, and James I of Aragon, Al-Andalus, was reduced to a fraction of its former glory. But then, Castile, the largest of the Christian realms and the spear point of the Reconquista, had grown weak and vulnerable. In 1474, the same year that King Henry IV of Castile died and Isabella seized the crown, Abu al-Hassan Ali ibn Sayyad took the Nasrid throne. He was an aggressive ruler who had built up the army of Granada, brought in the Guzat, holy warriors from the Maghreb of North Africa, and had even reached out to the Turks for assistance. The success of the Ottoman Empire far to the east, after all, only fueled his confidence and gave him the conviction that God was indeed on his side. Kristen Downey in the book The Warrior Queen explains, quote, Abu al-Hassan now saw Isabella's rise to power as a welcome sign of Castilian vulnerability. Soon after the princess became queen, and just around the time the Portuguese invaders surged into Castile, he made his ominous vow that he would no longer pay the vassalage payments that Granada had been giving Castile. He delivered his message in specifically threatening words. He said, "The days of Granadan tribute to Castile were over. Those sovereigns who paid tribute to the Christians are now dead, and in Granada, the only thing we are minting are iron and lances to be used against our enemies." End quote. Perhaps Abu al-Hassan had a good reason to feel this way. At Isabella's ascension in 1474, Castile was in turmoil and soon to be embraced in a massive war with Portugal. Indeed, even 3 years into her rule, when the Queen came to Seville, once a shining jewel of a city, she noted it was overrun with crime, its Alcazar was in decay, and the nobles were fighting in their own private war. Thus, in 1478, with her hands politically tied and her army engaged against the Portuguese, Isabella signed a 3-year treaty with the Nasrid. Their tribute payment was not even part of the deal. Three years after this treaty was signed, Ferdinand and Isabella were far to the north in Medina del Campo when they got word that Zahara had been taken by the Nasrid. The question now was, what would they do next? The conquest of the Kingdom of Granada had always been a goal that seemed just out of reach for the rulers of Castile. Suddenly, it had taken on an urgency like never before. The Nasrid were now more than capable of going on the offensive, and they were not alone. 30 years before, the Ottomans had taken Constantinople, ending a 1,000-year-old Christian empire. From there, their armies had advanced deep into Eastern Europe. And the very year before Zahara fell, an Ottoman armada had landed on the heel of the Italian boot and had taken the city of Otranto. They now had a toehold in southern Europe, and if they could link up with the Nasrid, they would be unstoppable in Western Europe. For Ferdinand and Isabella, there was only one final solution. It would be an all-out war. They knew that taking on the Nasrid would be a tough fight, but they were simply not prepared for just how difficult an adversary they were going to be. Granada was a mountainous kingdom. The eastern part of the country held a formidable range, nearly impassable to an army. In the west, however, there were mountainous river valleys that penetrated deep into the interior. However, imposing strong points, castles, and fortresses protected every road and pass. Every major city like Ronda and Granada were built into citadels. Its Mediterranean coast had vital seaports like Malaga, Marbella, and Almeria, where food, supplies, and troops were ferried in. Abu al-Hassan had also spent years building up the army. David Nicole in the book Granada 1492 gives insight. Quote, a review in 1478 estimated that the Nasrid had 4,700 cavalry and 50,000 infantry. The Granadan military elite was the Emir's Guard of Mamluks, also known as the Malughun. Recruited from young Christian prisoners converted to Islam, they were educated in the Alhambra Palace. They were regarded as renegados, traitors by the Christians, intended to receive poor treatment if captured. Unlike the Mamluks of Egypt, however, these men could expect their own sons to reach senior military positions. The motivation of Granada's military personnel was a mixture of traditional religious commitment and enthusiasm for defensive jihad, plus a personal honor code that had much in common with the chivalry seen on the Spanish side of the frontier. The permanent professional corps of the army largely consisted of cavalry based in fortress garrisons like Granada, Malaga, Ronda, and Guadix. The Emirate of Granada was very strongly fortified. However, Moorish strategy reflected their limited resources. It was essentially defensive. End quote. Now, as remarkable as the defenses of the Kingdom of Granada were, it also had many weaknesses. First, compared to the rest of Iberia, this was a densely populated area. When most of Al-Andalus had been captured by the north, the Muslim refugees had settled here. Feeding this population was a daunting task. There were fertile areas around every major city which were intensely cultivated, known as vegas, which helped provide some of the food. But these same farmlands could also be a great liability if they were captured or destroyed. Second, food was a major import which kept the ports busy, but these same ports could also be blockaded. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the political structure of the Nasrid was not stable. Rivals in the Nasrid royal family, and even prominent noble families like the Banu Sarraj, were consistently struggling for power. Granada was anything but internally united. Ferdinand and Isabella had their work cut out for them. The former used his impressive military insight and began formulating an overall strategy. The latter got to work shoring up alliances, calling in favors, raising funds, and sorting out logistics. They were a powerful couple, and in war, an even more formidable team. The first step was containment. Troops were sent to the borderlands to strengthen defenses while the rest of Castile and Aragon could mobilize. The bulk of the navy was also sent in to blockade Nasrid ports. Studying the maps in detail, Ferdinand came to the conclusion that this would have to be a systematic, meticulous campaign. He was regarded by historians as comparing the conquest of the cities of the Kingdom of Granada to picking out the seeds of a pomegranate. It had to be done one by one by one. However, just as meticulous and precise and calculating that the royal couple wanted to be in this war, their nobility decided that they had other plans, which involved rushing right in. Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, the Marquis of Cadiz, wanted payback for the Christians that were slaughtered at Zahara. On February 28, 1482, he and his army moved under the cover of night and took back roads to avoid being detected. They launched a surprise attack against Alhama, which was located deep within Nasrid territory. This town, ironically, was considered the eyes of the kingdom as it kept watch on all the incoming passes and served as an early warning system. Strategically, it was vital. It lay on a crossroads, including the road that connected the capital, Granada, with the fortress port city of Malaga. The Marquis' men moved in the shadow of a stormy night. They scaled the walls, opened the gates, and slaughtered the population. A Muslim historian would later say, the walls, the streets, the temples were left filled with corpses and bathed in blood. The Castilians then threw the bodies over the walls of the town, creating a moat of the dead. It was vicious, it was cruel, and it would set the tone for the rest of the war for both sides. Abu al-Hassan had to respond. He needed this vital town back. When his troops arrived at Alhama in March, they saw wild animals and stray dogs chewing on the remains of the corpses. This gruesome sight instigated intense fury, but when they attacked, they were thrown back by the Castilians, and the town would remain in the hands of the defenders. Later in May, Ferdinand would heavily reinforce the garrison. For the rest of the war, Alhama would be a knife at the throat of the Nasrid kingdom. After all, as the crow flies, it was located less than 20 miles from Granada. Ferdinand and Isabella now moved their headquarters up to the Alcazaba of Córdoba to plan their first royally sanctioned offensive. The early win at Alhama bred a certain degree of hubris. and so they decided that their first target would be the fortress of Loja. The troops that they brought in were from northern Iberia and were poorly experienced in fighting the Nasrid. In early July of 1482 near Loja, Ferdinand set up his camp on a hill hoping to use it as an artillery position, but his troops were scattered over a large area and this left him greatly exposed. The Nasrid garrison of Loja was comprised of lightly armored but fast-moving cavalry. When they saw Ferdinand's poor preparations, they devised a cunning assault. They divided their cavalry into two contingents, one racing in to lure the Castilians off the hill with a feigned retreat. The other contingent lay in hiding, and when the Castilians were chasing the first group, they raced in to attack the Castilian camp and the artillery batteries. Ferdinand at this point did not know which way to attack and was sandwiched between the two Nasrid groups. Chaos would ensue, and his men suffered just horrendous losses. Even the master of the Order of Calatrava was struck down when he was hit by 2 poisoned crossbow bolts. On July 7, 1482, Ferdinand had to order a general retreat, but this too was very poorly coordinated. Once again, the Nasrid cavalry took advantage of the situation, raced in, and slaughtered the Castilian line while it was on the march. The defeat at Loja was a major blow. Ferdinand arrived back at Córdoba with a fraction of his forces, and Isabella was horrified at the losses. Any illusion that this would be a quick war was now put aside, and the two Christian monarchs realized that they were contending with a very worthy adversary. But not all hope was lost. Isabella's connections in the papacy were having an effect. The Pope began to send in funds and declared that their conflict was a religiously sanctioned event. For the Nasrid, this had always been jihad. Going forward for Isabella and for Ferdinand, this was not going to be just a major conflict. For them, this was now going to be a holy war as well. Abu al-Hassan was jubilant. He traveled to Loja to celebrate his victory. The man seemed that he was unstoppable on the battlefield. However, despite how good he was on the Castilian front, his home front was a completely different matter. As he arrived at Loja, he got the dreadful news that his own son had rebelled against him, and in the process had taken his capital. Let's step back here for a second. Aisha bint Muhammad ibn al-Ammar, also known as Aisha al-Hurra, though some reference her simply as Fatima, was the strong-willed wife of Abu al-Hassan. When the Nasrid Sultan began to favor one of his converted Christian slaves in his harem, she grew angry. When Aisha learned that this concubine was pregnant, she became, well, intensely resentful. Now it should be mentioned that she had a son with the Sultan by the name of Muhammad XII, though he was known to the Castilians as Boabdil. Aisha al-Hurra persuaded her son that it was now time for new management. Muhammad No. 12 readily agreed, and while his father was off fighting, he staged a coup. Boabdil was supported by the powerful Banu Sarraj family, and with their help, he was soon lord of the Alhambra. The Kingdom of Granada was now divided between those who supported the young Muhammad, based in Granada, and his father, who had made Malaga his new capital. Arab chroniclers would lament and say, "This was a terrible rebellion that split open our very souls." The war with the Christians, however, was by no means over. In fact, the Castilian nobility, sensing weakness, now decided to move in on their own accord. From their forward base in Alhama, they decided to move on the rich, vital seaport of Malaga. They put on their best attire, brought out their fanfare and trumpets, and brought along with them plenty of empty wagons anticipating a lot of plunder. The Marquis of Cadiz, if you recall, the man who took Alhama and knew just how fierce the Nasrid were, urged strenuously against this move, but he was ignored. On March 19, 1483, the army moved out. They made no attempt to conceal their movement through the narrow mountain passes. They were quickly spotted. Abu al-Hassan sent in his brother, Muhammad XIII, also known as al-Zagal, to intercept this incoming force. Al-Zagal divided his men into three components. The first was to block the path of the Castilians, the second to sneak into the mountains surrounding the Castilian force, and the third contingent Al-Zagal commanded personally. He rode around the enemy army, arriving in the rear to block any retreat. The Castilian aristocracy marched right into this trap. Their heavy armor made movement difficult, and the mountains negated their ability to mount a heavy cavalry charge. When Al-Zagal gave the order to attack and his men rode in, it wasn't so much a fight as a complete and total massacre. Many Castilian noblemen were killed, the standard of the Order of Santiago was taken, and the Marquis of Cadiz barely escaped with his life. For the Castilians, it was another crushing defeat. Ferdinand was appalled and disgusted with the hubris of his men. He knew a new game plan was needed along with a better sense of caution and respect for their foe. Isabella realized that it was time to restructure the logistics of their army for a much more prolonged conflict. She also began building hospitals to tend for the wounded. Victory in the Reconquista now seemed as distant as ever. Meanwhile, Abu al-Hassan and his brother al-Zagal were now war heroes to their people. Their prestige exploded. Boabdil, if you recall, the young Muhammad, however, saw this as a threat to his leadership. He knew he had to be his father's equal on the battlefield if he was to retain his crown. He decided to one-up his dad and took the war into Castile. The young sultan gathered his army and his best commanders, and in April of 1483, he marched on the Castilian city of Lucena. The city came under siege, but on April 20th, a relieving Castilian army came in. Boabdil abandoned the siege to engage them. The ensuing fight was initially just a brutal confrontation. In the midst of the fighting, the young sultan attempted a feigned retreat. But as he moved his forces back, he encountered another enemy contingent shouting, "Remember Malaga! Remember Malaga!" They were shrouded in the morning mist, and the actual number of these men could not be discerned. Thus, the Sultan, fearing that another large force was moving in, ordered his men back again while his cavalry protected his withdrawal. The Nasrid force eventually moved to the Rio Henal to cross at a ford that they had used before, but when they arrived, the river was swollen by spring rains and now the ford was inundated. Retreat was now essentially cut off, and when Boabdil's best commander was killed, his front line broke and the Castilians took full advantage. They surged forward and decimated his army as they went. The Sultan himself was thrown by his horse into the river, where he attempted to hide in a bunch of tall reeds, but he was soon discovered. He would not have time to watch his army get absolutely destroyed. Instead, he was dispatched quickly to Cordoba, and in a few days he stood before Isabella and Ferdinand. The two monarchs referred with their most trusted advisors on what to do next with the young, brash Boabdil. The majority of the suggestions that they got really came down to either keeping him captive forever or executing him. Isabella, however, came up with another option that Ferdinand liked a lot. The two treated him with incredible dignity and respect, showering him with gifts. Ferdinand would even go so far as to embrace him and call him a close friend. The Sultan ate it up. When Aisha al-Hurra, again also known as Fatima, offered ransom to get her son back, Isabella accepted, and on September 2nd, 1483, Boabdil was released after he assured Ferdinand and Isabella that he would restore the peace and the tribute. It was a bit of a gamble to let him go, but it paid off. As calculated, the young sultan and his father would soon be back at odds, and the internal division of Granada would be as fierce as ever. This is perhaps one of the reasons why Ferdinand was Machiavelli's poster boy. This action assured that the Nasrid civil war would continue. It would seem that their high command was doing Ferdinand and Isabella's work for them. In late 1483, the tide began to turn against Abu al-Hassan. His forces were defeated at a great battle at Lopera, and in October, Zahara was retaken by Castile. That winter, Ferdinand greatly expanded his army. He created more cavalry forces, and taking a cue from his opponent, he began to raid the emirate with a newfound vengeance. Early the next year, in 1484, the armies of Castile and Aragon drove deep into Nasrid lands. Their goal wasn't so much to capture territory or cities, but rather to destroy crops and farmlands, and in doing so to obliterate the food supply. Many Muslim cities and towns now began to face starvation. Even the Vega of Granada was raided. To intensify the pressure and really drive home that attrition, the Castilian navy was reinforced at Gibraltar, and Nasrid ports were nearly cut off through blockade. Isabella sent a stern warning to the Genoese and the Venetians who were aiding the Nasrid. She stated that there would be, quote, serious reprisals if they continued to help the Muslims. Italian interference at this point came to an end. Ferdinand then brought in his artillery. On June 20th, 1484, after a prolonged bombardment, the city of Alora fell, followed by the town of Setenil on September 20th. His plan was working. The cities of Granada were falling one by one. The Aragonese king quickly realized just how effective his cannons were, and he set to work expanding his artillery corps. The size of his weaponry grew so big in terms of quantity and also in caliber that an entire corps of engineers had to be created in order to level roads, build bridges, and expand passes in order to get the massive cannon into place. While the Spanish cavalry would continue to raid and keep the Nasrid forces at bay, Ferdinand's artillery would lumber into place and level fortresses that were before impregnable. By 1485, the war had become more severe, brutal, perhaps even sinister, as both sides were exhausted with the prolonged conflict. Chivalry was giving way to maliciousness. On the home front, the Inquisition was going into high gear, rooting out heresy and traitors. 20 people in Seville alone were burnt at the stake. Rebellions in the borderlands were no longer tolerated. In the case of a border town that had a Mudéjar uprising, Mudéjar being Muslims living under Christian rule, Ferdinand moved in and viciously crushed them. He ordered the entire population to be enslaved, and the town leaders, over 100 of them, were to be hung. With these minor rebellions taken care of, he unleashed his army, not just to raid as he had done the year before, but now to conquer. After bitter fighting, the cities of Coin and Cartama fell in April of 1485. The Aragonese king, however, was just getting started. Meanwhile, earlier that year, Abu al-Hassan had grown ill. Some called it a heart attack, others called it a stroke, yet others say he was poisoned. He retired and died soon after, almost as foreshadowing. His concubine, the same one that caused all the previous trouble, renounced Islam, converted back to Christianity, and in time would become a lady in Isabella's court. Abu al-Hassan's brother al-Zagal was appointed the next sultan, and just like his predecessor, he too would prosecute the war with conviction. Al-Zagal had his work cut out for him. By this time, most of the western portion of the emirate was in the hands of the Spaniards. Only one major citadel was left, the city of Ronda. Ronda was built into a very defensible position, located atop a mesa and surrounded by cliffs. Despite the war raging all around it, the Nasrid garrisons of Ronda would continue to operate, raiding on any weak Castilian city and exploiting any target of opportunity. Thus, it was here that Ferdinand would next turn. A direct assault on the city, however, even with his cannon, could easily be routed. He knew he had to do something else. In early May 1485, Ferdinand maneuvered his men towards the city of Malaga, again the most valuable port in Nasrid hands. Al-Zagal maneuvered quickly to prepare for this incoming attack. He stripped the garrisons of multiple other locations in order to reinforce the port city. Even the garrison of Ronda was ordered to come in to aid in the defense. That attack never came. While Ferdinand moved towards Malaga, or at least appeared to do so, he deployed the Marquis of Cadiz with a fast-moving contingent of his army to maneuver back to Ronda and quickly place it under siege. When Al-Zagal figured out that he had been fooled, he immediately deployed the garrison of Ronda back, but it was too late. The city was now under siege and weakly defended. The Nasrid garrison, furthermore, was unable to fight its way through the Spanish blockade, despite multiple attempts, and had to fall back. In the process, they left the inhabitants of Ronda to their fate. Ferdinand now rerouted his artillery and brought the city under the big guns. The ensuing bombardment destroyed a big chunk of Ronda and set off huge fires that gutted the interior. He also ordered the stone stairs to the city which led down to the river to be destroyed. Doing this effectively cut off its water supply. Thus, the population that was surrounded, constantly under attack and now without water, grew more desperate by the day. After 2 weeks of absolutely stout defiance, on May 22nd, the city of Ronda surrendered. Kristen Downey gives us an astonishing tale. Quote, "This victory was very significant to Isabella, because capturing Ronda freed some 400 Christian slaves who were being held there. Among them were some of the people who had been seized back at Zahara. They were weak and starving and in need to be nursed back to health. Queen Isabella ordered the heavy chains that they wore to be placed in carts and hauled back to Toledo. There they were to be hung on the exterior walls of the monastery of San Juan de los Reyes as a reminder to worshippers of the hardships that the Christians had suffered." End quote. Oh, and by the way, those chains that Isabella brought back, they still hang there to this day. With the fall of Ronda, the western portion of the Kingdom of Granada would also fall, including the vital port of Marbella, which was taken later that year. But despite their successes, Isabella and Ferdinand had brought their treasury, their country, and their people to the breaking point. Casualties were heavy on both sides, and they knew that mistakes had been made. However, for the first time since the war began, the path to the capital, Granada, now seemed like a very real possibility. That said, Al-Zagal was more determined as an opponent as ever before. Despite the advantages that the Catholic monarchs had in terms of men, material, cannon, the Nasrid Sultan was going to make them pay for every inch of conquest. Al-Zagal was going to prove that one does not simply walk into Granada. The Sultan of Granada, Muhammad XIII, known to his people as Al-Zagal, which meant the brave, was an astute military commander with a firm resolve. He studied the map and knew that the western part of his kingdom was now lost to the Castilians, who had taken the citadel of Ronda and then the vital port of Marbella. Al-Zagal was undeterred. He rallied his men. In late 1485, he launched one vicious attack after another. In 3 separate engagements, he crushed the Spaniards. At one point, his men even wounded the Count of Cabra near Alhama, and later they retook the city of Moclin, routing a Castilian army in the process. But now Al-Zagal was forced to turn his attention inward to another adversary. This time it would be his own nephew, Muhammad XII, also known as Boabdil. Boabdil had been released from captivity 3 years prior by Isabella and Ferdinand. As they predicted, the young sultan had gone on to incite a civil war with his uncle. But Al-Zagal was not going to tolerate his nephew for long. When opportunity presented itself, he attacked ferociously back, driving Boabdil from the Kingdom of Granada to the relative safety of Castilian lands in Murcia. The Sultan's prestige and his army grew. Only when the winter of 1485–86 came was there an end to his campaigning season. But Al-Zagal eagerly awaited the coming of spring to renew the attack on the Christians of the north, to pay back aggression with aggression. Ferdinand and Isabella welcomed the cessation in fighting. Their armies, as well as their treasury, were exhausted. What's more, on a much more personal level, they were anticipating a new arrival to the family. On December 16, 1485, Princess Catherine was born. She would be fated to be their youngest child, and she was truly adored. Ferdinand would bestow upon her his kingdom's namesake. This princess would be known as Catherine of Aragon, and in time she would ascend to the position of the Queen of England. But that is a great story unto itself. Isabella was delighted to have another daughter, and like with the rest of her children, she would instill Catherine with an incredible education and nurture her to have a very strong will. The Catholic monarch's joy at the birth of their new child, however, would be very short-lived. In early 1486, they received the unsettling news that Boabdil had gone back on his word. He was no longer going to be a vassal to Castile. Instead, he had made an alliance with Al-Zagal. The civil war between uncle and nephew was over, and now the Kingdom of Granada had been unified. As winter came to an end and spring began, Ferdinand mobilized his troops and Isabella mobilized the economy. The royal couple prepared for another year of war. In April of 1486, Ferdinand took the initiative and led his army to attack the fortress of Loja. This was the very same city where he had been defeated nearly 4 years before, but he had learned from his mistakes. This time he brought more caution, respect for his enemy, and to top it off, an absolutely massive contingent of artillery. Brian Catless, in his book Kingdoms of Faith, describes it really well. Quote, "The immense bombards that Ferdinand brought to the front, some of which were crewed by hundreds of soldiers and overseen by expert gunners from France and Italy, could open a breach in any wall, no matter how thick. And the taller the wall, the better the target. What had once been impregnable was now suddenly vulnerable." End quote. In May of 1486, the siege of Loja began. Boabdil, after asking his uncle for the assignment, was deployed to the city to take command, and there he put up a firm resistance. Ferdinand moved his men in and cautiously surrounded the city. His lumbering cannon were brought up, and over the next few days, they proceeded to reduce the immense city walls to rubble. The Spaniards advanced into the city, and after intense fighting, they occupied it. Eventually, only the citadel remained. From here, Boabdil continued to command his men. Ferdinand, however, moved up his cannon and brought this last Muslim refuge under bombardment. Boabdil was heavily injured in the crossfire, and by late May, with his city teetering on collapse, he was forced to surrender Loja. The defenders of the city, the few that were left, were allowed to honorably leave. Boabdil wasn't. He instead was taken captive by Isabella and Ferdinand again. To his people, Boabdil would now be known as Al-Zugoibi, the unlucky or the ill-fated. Ferdinand now pushed the offensive and intensified his attacks. Numerous Nasrid towns fell, including the strategic city of Mackula. Then, in June of 1486, the last city on the road to Granada, Illora, was taken after a determined defense. With this victory and a growing sense of hubris, the Aragonese king now ordered his men into the Vega of Granada to destroy the fertile lands that were there. But here, Al-Zagal awaited him with an ambush. The Sultan had brought together his cavalry and his elite warriors, concentrating them into a highly mobile, very effective fighting contingent, which he proceeded to launch into a surprise attack that took his enemy completely off guard. Ferdinand's men were forced back, sustaining heavy casualties. At a bridge over a tributary of the Rio Genal known as Pinos Puente, the Spaniards put up a last-ditch defense that managed to finally stop the Nasrids from advancing further, but this came at a very high cost. It became clear to Isabella and Ferdinand that the road to Granada was still too dangerous, especially with such a determined adversary as Al-Zagal. A new plan was needed. In September of 1486, Isabella and Ferdinand met with Boabdil to strike a new agreement. Boabdil was given the title Duke of Baza and Guadix in exchange for his loyalty and a commitment to be a vassal to Castile and Aragon once again. On September 15, 1486, he was released from captivity and returned to the emirate with Castilian military aid. Once Boabdil was back in his own land, he quickly organized his supporters, which included the powerful noble family, the Banu Sarraj. With his fighting force established, the young Boabdil led them to storm Granada. Fighting erupted everywhere in the streets of the capital. While Boabdil's men did manage to take the city, Al-Zagal maintained hold of the Alhambra, but this would require a considerable garrison of his best soldiers to hold the palace fortress. The Nasrid civil war had been reignited and Al-Zagal now had to fight on two fronts once again. When word got back to Isabella and Ferdinand, they were overjoyed. Ferdinand jumped on this opportunity. He now picked one of the most challenging targets he could find. His army was now deployed to the city of Malaga. On April 7, 1487, Ferdinand moved out from Córdoba with an army of 20,000 soldiers, most of whom were cavalry. He also brought in an additional 8,000 support troops. His heavy artillery came up at the rear with a corps of engineers, leveling forests, paving roads, and building bridges to make way for their lumbering weight. On Easter Sunday, April 17, 1487, the Spanish army arrived at the coastal town of Valise, Malaga, which needed to be taken as it lay on the approach to Malaga itself. At this point, Al-Zagal made the tough decision to divide his garrison at Granada in order to fight this incoming army. The Sultan quickly spotted Ferdinand's slow-moving artillery corps, which lagged behind the main army, and immediately deployed his fast-moving cavalry to destroy it. However, Ferdinand had wisely kept a protective contingent of men to protect the big guns, and had even gone so far as to order reinforcements under the command of the Marquis of Cadiz to move up. When Al-Zagal saw the incoming reinforcements, he called off the assault, but he wasn't done yet. He decided instead to use the element of surprise. The Sultan dispatched his elite renegados. The renegados, by the way, were Christian slaves converted to Islam at an early age and who were indoctrinated into the military, becoming impressive soldiers. The renegados were ordered to coordinate with the garrison in Valise, Malaga for a combined night attack. However, the messenger that was sent was intercepted by the Castilians and confessed the entire plan. Meanwhile, Al-Zagal, who was unaware that this had happened, launched his attack anyway. On the night of April 25th, as the Nasrid forces moved into position to begin their assault, they stumbled into the center of the entire Spanish army which was waiting for them. Ferdinand had ordered them to remain silent and hidden in the darkness without fires. Suddenly, bonfires were lit, and the two armies erupted into savage fighting. The element of surprise had been reversed, and while the outnumbered Muslim army was able to hold its own throughout the night and well into the morning, the weight of numbers would eventually win out. Al-Zagal and his battered troops were driven off, and with no other reinforcements coming in, Valise, Malaga would surrender on April 27, 1487. The Sultan had lost a major fight. His prestige plummeted, and the road to his best port, Malaga, was now open to Ferdinand. But for Al-Zagal, things were only going to get worse. As his wounded army limped its way from the battle, he got word that his garrison back in the Alhambra had defected to Boabdil's side, and thus Al-Zagal had also lost Granada. He was now forced to move on to Guadix, which would be his new capital. Back along the coast, Ferdinand and his army had already started to move on to Malaga. The Castilian navy would come in to provide close support as well. On May 7, 1487, the great port city came under siege. Hamid al-Zagri was the formidable commander of the Malaga garrison. His men consisted mainly of North African soldiers, with a sizable portion of the elite renegados. Ferdinand attempted numerous times to convince him to surrender, to which Hamid would repeatedly respond, "I was sent here to defend, not to surrender." For hundreds of years, Malaga was the greatest port city under Nasrid rule. Its defenses were remarkable. The thick city walls were dotted with towers and strongpoints. Inside was the nearly impregnable fortress of Gibralfaro, known then as the Rabita. On a nearby hill was the Alcazaba, the citadel. Hamid al-Zagri had used his time to reinforce the city and had expertly deployed his men. Now, it should be noted that both sides had cannons, but Ferdinand had brought bigger ones and in much greater quantity. His artillery assault began almost immediately. The Castilian navy would also sail in and close down the harbor. It would go so far as to shell the city from the water whenever opportunity presented itself. Over the next several days, the Christian army dug in, creating an extensive series of interconnected siege works. Malaga was soon cut off. However, despite this, resistance in the city only increased. When Ferdinand's cannons breached the outer walls, the Muslims retreated into the city, using their own cannons to inflict heavy casualties at point-blank range on any incoming Spanish attack. Hamid al-Zagri also masterfully concentrated his men into strong fighting contingents that would sally forth from the city to assault the besiegers, only to fall back to the Alcazaba to fight another day. In the midst of all this fighting, Boabdil sent a message reassuring Isabella and Ferdinand that he was committed to being their vassal and that he would redouble his efforts to attack Al-Zagal. To his credit, Al-Zagal was able to send in some relieving forces to attack the siege works, but this effort was hamstrung by his nephew, who he'd have to fight as well. The siege of Malaga would drag on. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Castilian morale crumbled and Ferdinand's men began to desert en masse. Meanwhile, Ferdinand grew increasingly angry and impatient. He ordered the construction of siege towers and had his engineers build tunnels to undermine the walls. The Muslim defenders responded by destroying the incoming siege towers with their cannons and counter-mining the Castilian engineers, collapsing their tunnels and killing them in the process. As time went on, the fighting grew ever more savage. At one point, to boost morale, the Catholic Church even authorized that Muslim heads be paraded through the Christian camp. And Hamid al-Zagri authorized an assassination attempt on the king and queen, which in the end was unsuccessful, but the assassin did come very close to accomplishing his goal. By August of 1487, Ferdinand's men had captured portions of the outer wall. The defenders abandoned the city and retreated to their last line of defense, where they held on tenaciously, taunting the exhausted Christian soldiers whose morale had now reached a low point. For a brief time in that summer of 1487, it would seem that the siege was going to fail. The defenders were too well entrenched, and the resolve of the Spaniards was waning. Then Isabella and her court arrived at the siege. The sight of the queen boosted morale as never before. She had used her logistical abilities to create baggage wagons, which brought in more supplies, and carried the sick and wounded back to hospital camps, which she had established. The queen walked amongst her men, giving them courage, restoring their resolve with an almost maternal nature. The siege and the fighting would continue. By late August, the Muslim defenders were starving, and even their strong defensive positions were giving way to a seemingly endless artillery barrage. No reinforcements were coming in, no new supplies could make it into the city, and so Hamid al-Zagri finally had to go back on his word. On August 18, 1487, the city surrendered. Because the defenders had been so defiant and the siege had lasted so long, Ferdinand's fury at this point was unleashed. The entire population of the city was enslaved. Most of the garrison was executed. The elite renegados, who had caused a considerable amount of the destruction, were brought out of the city, chained to posts, and then used as live target practice. It was said of Hamid al-Zagri that he was sent to the Pope as a present, later to die imprisoned in the dungeons of Rome. As for the Spanish soldiers who had deserted, they were rounded up, brought together, and simply burned at the stake for all to watch. With the capture of Malaga, the western part of the Kingdom of Granada was secured. It was now time to open another front. At the beginning of 1488, al-Zigal held the cities of Baza, Guadix, and the last Nasrid port, Almeria. When the campaigning season began, al-Zigal was once more on the warpath, but his focus wasn't geared so much against the Christians of the north, but rather against his nephew Boabdil, who was well positioned in Granada. This infighting of the Nasrid crippled both factions and gave Isabella and Ferdinand the chance to invade the eastern portion of the emirate. The Spanish army invaded from Murcia in June of 1488. Several smaller towns were taken, but when Ferdinand attacked Almeria, al-Zigal showed that he still possessed mastery of the battlefield. Near Almeria, the Nasrid Sultan mustered his remaining strength and drove off Ferdinand's army. He then pursued the offensive. At a second engagement near Baza, al-Zigal, personally leading his men, annihilated a portion of this invading force. Ferdinand was forced to retreat, and once again he had to rethink his strategy. The next year, the Aragonese king would return, but he brought much greater strength and his impressive artillery corps. In June of 1489, the city of Baza would come under siege. Much like Malaga, Baza was a powerful fortress, and thus the siege would have to be an extensive one. Ferdinand encircled the city, put up his siege works, and brought his big guns to bear. Unlike at Malaga, at Baza there was a newfound determination amongst his men. Kristen Downey in The Warrior Queen explains, quote, "By 1489, the Castilian troops encamped around Baza had become a cohesive fighting force. High morale was evident to everyone. The soldiers came from all different parts of Spain, from Asturias, from Galicia, from the Basque Country, and joined with the Castilians and the Aragonese. They all spoke different dialects, but nonetheless got along surprisingly well. They were united in a sense of combined purpose. They were becoming a nation now organized under a religious banner." End quote. Boabdil, meanwhile, deciding that this was his uncle's city, simply did nothing to help the defenders. Al-Zigal saw the strength and the resolve of his opponent, and he knew he lacked the force to attack the besiegers. Despite this, the siege dragged on for months. The cost of fielding so many soldiers in this siege, along with the fighting forces on other fronts, was astronomical. It bankrupted Ferdinand and Isabella's treasury. In fact, halfway through the siege, Isabella had to pawn her own jewelry in order to pay for the war. In November of 1489, Isabella came to Baza to show her commitment to the siege. Her mere presence and the reputation of how she cared for her soldiers like they were her own children caused morale to soar. At the very same time, the sight of the Queen walking amongst her troops caused Muslim morale in the city to crash. A message under truce soon arrived at Isabella's doorstep. The garrison was ready to surrender. With the Queen present, the people of Baza felt that the terms of surrender would be much more merciful. Nobody wanted a repeat of the aftermath of Malaga. And so, on December 4th, 1489, the city officially lowered its flags. Al-Zagal took the loss of Baza especially hard. He was a fighter, nobody could say otherwise. But strategically, he knew his war was over. In late December, he approached Ferdinand and Isabella, at which time he ceded Guadix and later Almeria, selling everything he owned in Andalusia for 20,000 Castellanos. The Sultan was given the option to stay in Al-Andalus, but he was not willing to bear this indignation. He still possessed his sense of valor. Al-Zagal departed across the sea to the Maghreb of North Africa. He was never again to set foot in Iberia. The Arab chronicler Nujat al-Asir would say of his crossing, quote, "Many people assert that Al-Zagal and his commanders sold these villages and districts to the ruler of Castile just to receive a price for them. But all this was done with a view of taking revenge on the son of his brother. By his action, he wanted to cut off Granada so as to destroy it in the way that the rest of the country had been destroyed." End quote. The Kingdom of Granada was now just the city of Granada, where Boabdil sat on a throne in the Alhambra, surrounded by an overwhelming enemy determined to bring him down. Ironically enough, it was at this point that he became determined to fight to the end. In 1490, the armies of Christendom moved in to tighten the noose amidst weakening Nasrid resistance. The Emirates still had the ability to conduct a few raids, but little else. Food and supplies were running low, yet Boabdil continued to fight. Ferdinand and Isabella came again in 1491. This time, instead of taking smaller towns, their goal was the capital itself. In April of that year, a massive siege line was established around Granada. All roads leading into the city were cut off, and there were no more ports to bring in supplies or reinforcements. Every day as the inhabitants of Granada would wake up, they would witness new siege works being assembled. Ferdinand had perfected the art of encirclement. Boabdil sent out desperate requests to the nations of North Africa for help. None responded. The Sultan's own vizier, Abu al-Qasim Abd al-Malik, approached him and stated that the capital only had a few months of food left, but Boabdil was undeterred. He ordered his men to hold the line. Indeed, the Muslim elite cavalry would emerge from the Alhambra to challenge their Spanish rivals in individual combat. The Christian knights seeking glory would engage them, but at the gates of the Alhambra, the Nasrid would prove superior in one-to-one combat. Ferdinand had to ban this practice as so many of his esteemed knights were being killed. The siege of the capital would drag on for several months. Inside the city, the situation was becoming desperate. The inhabitants of Granada put their last faith that the coming winter would force the Christian forces to withdraw. But this belief was soon shattered. Brian Catless explains, quote, "In 1491, Ferdinand and Isabella began to assemble a massive siege camp known as Santa Fe, virtually a city in itself below the walls of Granada. There could be little doubt as to how the war would end, and scores of Christian glory seekers poured in, emboldened by the guarantee of victory and the patina of moral vindication provided by the Crusade bull. In the city itself, the inhabitants now resigned themselves to their fate. They appointed a committee to negotiate the best possible terms of surrender. But unbeknownst to all, Boabdil had opened up his own secret negotiations aimed at achieving the best possible outcome for himself." End quote. In November of 1491, the terms of surrender had been written. The final capitulation of the city would come on Epiphany, January 6, 1492. However, Boabdil worried that when word got out that he had made his own deal, insurrection would follow, so the final date was set a few days earlier. On January 1st, 1492, the last sultan of the last kingdom of Islam in the Reconquista ceremoniously handed over the keys of the city. 781 years of Muslim rule in Iberia was now gone forever. Boabdil departed the Alhambra, arriving at a small bridge. As the story goes, which could be simply apocryphal, the Sultan turned back to see his beloved city one last time. He sighed and began to cry on what would later be known as the Bridge of Sighs. As the story continues, Boabdil's mother, the formidable Fatima, would scold him and say, "Do not weep as a woman for what you could not defend as a man." The Sultan, like his uncle, was given the option to stay, but he was not able to tolerate this for long. Eventually, he would take ship and depart. He left Iberia and traveled across the sea to North Africa. As it was recorded, Boabdil was to remain forever in exile and would later die in the city of Fez in 1533. He was never to see his beautiful capital again. Back in Granada on January 2nd, 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand, wearing the clothing style of those that they had just conquered, entered the Alhambra to celebrate the Christian Mass. Their great war was finally over. In a nearby hill of the Alhambra, their soldiers discovered caves that had been converted into dungeons, which had held over 7,000 Christian slaves. Only 1,500 were alive at the time of their liberation. The royal couple saw to it personally that these survivors were nourished back to health. The Reconquista had finally come to an end. Downey puts it well, quote, "The victory over Granada won acclaim for Isabella and Ferdinand throughout Europe. It was the first significant triumph against Islam in hundreds of years, and to many Europeans, it was partial payback for the loss of Constantinople." Ferdinand moved quickly to make sure he was given full credit for the achievement. He would say, "We desire you to know that it has pleased our Lord to give complete victory to the king and destruction to the kingdom of Granada and to the foes of our Catholic faith. After many labors, costs, deaths, and much shedding of our subjects' blood, on 2nd January of this year of grace, 1492, you have here a Catholic land." End quote. One chapter in history had come to a close, but the story would not end here. Isabella had definitively seen to that. She had already started the process of weaponizing religious indoctrination. On one end, it was time, as the esteemed Professor Hugh Kennedy would say, to bid farewell to Al-Andalus. A nation, a people, a religion had been conquered in Iberia, but the process of assimilation had only begun. And in that endeavor, Isabella was driven to prove that resistance would be futile. It was on a rain-soaked day in the city of Medina del Campo on November 26, 1504, that Queen Isabella took her last breath. As she closed her eyes for the last time, she was surrounded by many members of her court. Throughout her kingdom, she was in the hearts and the minds of her subjects. King Ferdinand was there, along with her dear childhood friend and confidant, Beatriz de Bobadilla. The city and the nation went into a state of mourning at the news that they had lost their beloved queen. Despite her long war with Granada, Isabella had a great fondness for the style, architecture, and decor of Andalusia. Thus, eventually, she would be entombed in the Capilla Real in Granada, an impressive final resting place that was constructed using a fusion of Gothic, Renaissance, and Mudéjar styles, which Isabella was extremely fond of. The Capilla Real, by the way, was built by her grandson Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor, if that gives any idea of what level her family had ascended to. The kingdom descended into a chaotic period of transition at the death of so powerful a sovereign. But within 20 years of Isabella's death, Spain would emerge as a superpower, and within 50 years, The sun would not set on the empire that she had laid the foundation for. She had taken her kingdom from the brink of destruction into a golden age, but some of her methods were brutal and embellished in religious fundamentalism. To some, she died a saint, venerated and enshrined, but to others she was the devil incarnate, loathed and detested. The queen's health had been declining for some time. Some say that she never fully recovered from the deaths of two of her children. Her eldest daughter, Isabel, died in 1498 during childbirth, and her only son, and at the time heir, John, died in 1497 shortly after he was married into the Habsburg family. Isabella's last few months were agonizing. She had bouts of fever. At times her breathing would be erratic. Sometimes her strength would fail her altogether, and it was said that tumors could be seen protruding from her skin. But even to the very end, she was industrious. She used this time to finalize her last will and testament, where she made stipulations to secure her children's political positions and announced that her daughter, Juana, to be her next heir. She would ask of Ferdinand not to remarry, and many think this was done more to avoid succession issues rather than a sense of fondness. Finally, she even ordered that all of her possessions be sold to help the poor. Now, it needs to be mentioned that not all of these stipulations were followed. Ferdinand would undermine a lot of what Isabella had asked for in order to secure power, which led to a period of turmoil. However, despite this, for good or for bad, Queen Isabella had left a legacy that was absolutely incredible. More than 12 years prior to Isabella's death, the Treaty of Granada had been signed. It ended Islamic rule in Iberia, but granted Muslims a set of rights which included religious tolerance. It also stipulated that the Jewish population of Spain had to leave or convert within 3 years. With this document signed, Isabella and Ferdinand made their triumphant way into what was now their Alhambra on January 2nd, 1492. They had defeated the Nasrid, and by conquering Granada, they had completed the Reconquista. Isabella moved quickly to secure the peace, and in this endeavor she saw herself first and foremost as a defender of the faith, that is, Roman Catholicism. The Queen had been preparing for this her entire life. She saw herself as the new Joan of Arc. In 1478, 3 years before the Granada War was even over, the Spanish Inquisition was initiated, mostly on Isabella's insistence, but Ferdinand didn't resist its creation either. Initially, it was designed to identify heretics amongst those who had converted to Christianity, but it soon grew, expanded, and spread. In the process, it took up the mission to secure orthodoxy within the entire population. Its methods were brutal. Before long, watching people burn at the stake became a common sight, and even members of the high aristocracy began to fear for their lives. The Inquisition was forged in war and was weaponized into a tool of control. Kristen Downey in The Warrior Queen gives some perspective. Quote, "The Spanish Inquisition was vicious and tragic, but from Isabella's perspective, it unified Spain and allowed it to quell internal religious dissension, thereby allowing it to look outward. It was one of the largest, and from Isabella's point of view, one of the most successful forced conversions in Spanish history. For the Catholic monarchs, eliminating outsiders had its advantages. Spain was now on the verge, ready and sufficiently ruthless, of becoming the greatest power ever known." End quote. What some would justify as a move towards orthodoxy, others saw as religious fundamentalism and intolerance. But regardless of the way you looked at it, the process was only getting started. It was only a few months after the war with Granada had ended that the Alhambra Decree was issued on March 31st, 1492. It was also known as the Edict of Expulsion. The Jewish population, estimated at approximately 300,000, were told to either leave or convert immediately. Those that did not comply with the Alhambra decree faced the very real specter of summary execution. 1/3 of that population decided to leave. The remaining 2/3 stayed and converted, but these converts, or conversos as they were known, were never fully trusted, and many lived as second-class citizens under the reign of the Catholic monarchs, always under the very watchful eye of the Inquisition. You know, under his eye, so to speak. For the Muslims of Iberia, the Mudahar, time was also running out. Granada was an extremely wealthy and prosperous land. It made sense to keep the Muslims in place, as many served in the position of high administration, where they kept the bureaucracy afloat and kept the tax revenue coming in. But tensions would always be high between the Muslims and the Christians of Andalusia. An entire decade of intense fighting between the two religions, after all, had created powerful intolerances. In time, the Muslims also began to live as second-class citizens and would be subjected to severe taxes. Indeed, in certain cases, forced conversions also became more common. In 1497, a brief tax revolt erupted, and then in 1499, a massive rebellion broke out in Granada. By the next year, Ronda, Malaga, and Almeria joined in the revolt. Ferdinand and Isabella unleashed their armies and crushed the rebellion in 1501, but now they had cause to turn against their Muslim subjects. The Treaty of Granada was revoked, and the Muslims were given the same choice as the Jewish population 9 years prior: get baptized or go into exile. Once again, many left, and those that remained who took up the cross were looked upon with extreme suspicion. Their livelihoods would only get worse in time. The entrenched Christian communities, those that had been living in Iberia for centuries, began to demand preferred treatment as compared to the conversos. As such, laws and edicts known as the limpieza de sangre, literally meaning cleanliness of the blood or blood purity, were issued. These laws, when they came into effect, reduced conversos to the status of subservience. Isabella, as I've mentioned, was to some a saint. She arose from obscurity to become a queen. On one end, she raised her country and economy from a state of destitution to the level of being a powerhouse. The government was reformed, the army and the navy were revitalized. She fought and won a war against Portugal, and with her husband Ferdinand, she ended the Reconquista. She made smart alliances with the major countries of Europe and had some serious connections in the Vatican. She set a precedence for educating her children, including the women, which would become a much more mainstream thing throughout Europe. But on the other end, to some, Isabella was a demon. Her logistical insight kept the war in Granada going for nearly 10 long, brutal years. Her soldiers, in time, became fanatical in what they saw was a holy war. She was a religious zealot that forced orthodoxy and established the Inquisition. It was her signature that was on the edicts and laws that sent hundreds of thousands of people into exile. Isabella had created a formidable country, but she'd also created a military machine backed up by a powerful economy and infused it with a fierce, religiously fanatical resolve. Now, just as fate would have it, this religious and military machine was now poised to be unleashed upon a world stage. Going back to that fateful year of 1492, shortly after Isabella and Ferdinand had accepted the symbolic key to the city of Granada from the Sultan Boabdil and had entered the Alhambra in glorious victory, a Genoese explorer approached the palace with an idea to find India by sailing west instead of east. After much debate, Isabella decided to fund this man's expedition and gave him 3 ships. His expedition would bring in untold riches, while at the same time it unleashed immense suffering. It would have a profound effect on history as it brought Spain's newfound military and religious might to a new world. This man's name was Christopher Columbus, and whether he truly earned it or not, it was with him that the next chapter in history was about to begin.